The Shadow Over Innsmouth by H.P. Lovecraft. During the winter of 1927 to 1928, officials of the federal government made a strange and secretive investigation of certain conditions in the ancient Massachusetts seaport of Innsmouth. The public first learned of it in February, when a vast series of raids and arrests occurred, followed by the deliberate burning and dynamiting, under suitable precautions, of an enormous number of crumbling, worm-eaten and supposedly empty houses along the abandoned waterfront. An inquiring source let this occurrence pass as one of the major clashes, a spasmodic war on liquor. Keener news followers, however, wondered at the prodigious number of arrests, and the abnormally large force of men used in making them, and the secrecy surrounding the disposal of prisoners. No trials, or even definite charges were reported, nor were any of the captives seen thereafter in the regular jails of the nation. There were vague statements about disease and concentration camps, and later about dispersal in various naval and military prisons, but nothing positive ever developed. Innsmouth itself was left almost depopulated, and is even now only beginning to show signs of sluggish revival existence. Complaints from many liberal organizations were met with long confidential discussions, and representatives were taken on trips to certain camps and prisons. As a result, these societies became surprisingly passive. Newspaper men were harder to manage, but seemed largely to cooperate with the government in the end. Only one paper, a tabloid, always discounted because of its wild policy, mentioned the deep-diving submarine that discharged torpedoes downward in the marine abyss just beyond the Devil Reef. That item, gathered by chance in a haunt of sailors, seemed indeed rather far-fetched, since the low black reef lies a full mile and a half out from Innsmouth harbour. People around the country and in the nearby towns muttered a great deal among themselves, but said very little to the outer world. They had talked about dying in half-deserted Innsmouth for nearly a century, and nothing new could be more wilder or hideous than what they had whispered and hinted years before. Many things had taught them secretiveness, and there was now no need to exert pressure on them. Besides, they really knew very little, for wide salt marshes, desolate and unpeopled, keep neighbours off from Innsmouth and the landward slide. But at last, I am going to defy the ban on speech about this thing. Results, I am certain, are so thorough that no public harm, save a shock of repulsion, could ever occur from hinting of what was found by those horrified raiders at Innsmouth. Besides, what was found might possibly have more than one explanation. I do not know how much of a whole tale has been told, even to me, and I have many reasons for not wishing to probe deeper. For my contact with this affair has been closer than that of any other layman, and I have carried away impressions which are yet to drive me to drastic measures. It was I who fled frantically out of Innsmouth in the early morning hours of July 16th, 1927, and whose frightened appeals of the government inquiry and action brought on the whole reported episode. I was willing enough to say mute while the affair was fresh and uncertain, but now that is an old story. With public interest and curiosity gone, I have an odd craving to whisper about those few frightful hours in the ill-rumoured and evilly shadowed seaport of death, and the blasphemous abnormity. The mere telling helps me to restore confidence in my own faculties, to reassure myself that I was not simply the first to succumb to the contagious nightmare hallucination. It helps me, too, in making up my mind regarding a certain terrible step which lies ahead of me. I never heard of Innsmouth till the day before. I saw it for the first time and So far, last time, I was celebrating my coming of age by a tour of New England, sightseeing, antiquarian and genealogical, and had planned to go directly from ancient Newburyport to Arkham, whence my mother's family was derived. I had no car, but was travelling by train, trolley and motor coach, always seeking the cheapest possible route. In Newburyport they told me that the steam train was the thing to take to Arkham, and it was the only station ticket office. When I demurred at the high fare, that I learned about Innsmouth, the stout, shrew-faced agent whose speech shewed him to be no local man, seemed sympathetic towards my efforts at the economy, and made a suggestion that none of my other informants had offered. "You could take that old bus, I suppose," he said with a certain hesitation. "But it ain't thought much of hereabouts. It goes through Innsmouth. You may have heard about that. And so the people don't like it. Run by an Innsmouth fellow, Joe Sargent. But never gets any custom from here, or Arkham either, I guess. Wonder if it keeps running at all. I suppose it's cheap enough, but I never see more than 2 or 3 people in it. Nobody but those Innsmouth folks. Leaves the square, front of Hammond's drugstore at 10 a.m. and 7 p.m. unless they've changed lately. Looks like a terrible rattletrap. Never been on it." That was the first I have ever heard of Shadowed Innsmouth. Any reference to a town not shown on common maps or listed in recent guidebooks would have interested me, and the agent's odd manner and allusion roused something like a real curiosity. A town able to inspire such dislike in its neighbours, I thought, must be at least rather unusual and worthy of a tourist's attention. If it came before Arkham, I would stop off there, and so I asked the agent to tell me something about it. He was very deliberate and spoke with an air of feeling slightly superior to what he said. "Innsmouth? Well, it's a queer kind of town down at the mouth of Manuet. Used to be almost a city. Quite a port before the War of 1812. But all gone to pieces in the last 100 years or so. No railroad and no B&M never went through, and the branch line from Rowley was given up years ago. More empty houses than there are people, I guess. And no business to speak of except fishing and lobstering. Everybody trades mostly either here or in Arkham or Ipswich. Once they had quite a few mills, but nothing's left now except for one gold refinery running on the leaniest kind of part-time. That refinery, though, used to be a big thing. An old man Marsh who owns it must be richer than Croesus. Queer old duck, though in sticks mighty close in his home. He's supposed to have developed some sort of skin disease or deformity late in life that makes him keep out of sight. Grandson of the old Captain Obadiah Marsh, who founded the business. His mother seems to have been some kind of foreigner. They say a South Sea Islander. So everybody raised Cain when he married an Ipswich girl 50 years ago. They always do that about Innsmouth people and folks here and thereabouts. Always try to cover up any Innsmouth blood they have in them. But Marsh's children and grandchildren look like anyone else so far I can see. I've had him pointed out to me here, though. Come to think of it, the elder children don't seem to be around lately. Never saw the old man. And why is everybody so down on Innsmouth? Well, young fellow, you mustn't take much stock in what people around here say. They're hard to get started, but once they do get started, they never let up. They've been telling things about Innsmouth, whispering them, mostly for the last 100 years, I guess. And I gather they're more scared than anything else. Some of the stories would make you laugh. About old Captain Marsh driving bargains with the devil and bringing out imps out of hell to live in Innsmouth. Or about some kind of devil worship and awful sacrifices in some places near the wharves that people stumbled on around 1845 or thereabouts. But I come from Panton, Vermont, and this kind of story won't go down with me. You ought to hear, though, what some of the old timers tell about the Black Reef of the coast. Devil's Reef, they call it. It's well above the water, a good part of the time, never much below it. But you could hardly call it an island. The story there is that there's a whole legion of devils seen sometimes on the reef, sprawled out or darting in and out of some kind of caves near the top. It's a rugged, uneven thing. Got a bit over a mile out. Toward the end of the shipping days, sailors used to make big detours to avoid it. That is, sailors that didn't hail from Innsmouth. One of the things they had against old Captain Marsh was that he was supposed to land on it sometimes at night when the tide was right. Maybe he did, for I dare say the rock formation was interesting. It's just barely possible he was looking for some pirate loot, and maybe finding it. But there was talk of his dealing with the demons there. Fact is, I guess on the whole it was really the captain that gave the bad reputation to the reef. There was that big epidemic of 1846, when over half the folk in Innsmouth was carried off. I never did quite figure out what the trouble was, but it was some foreign kind of disease brought from China or somewhere by the shipping. Surely bad enough, there were riots all over it, and all sorts of ghastly doings that I don't believe ever gone outside of the town. And they left the place in an awful shape. Never came back. Can't be more than 300 or 400 people living there now. The real thing behind the way the folks is simply race prejudice. And I don't say I'm blaming those that hold it. I hate those Innsmouth folks myself. I wouldn't care to go to their town, I suppose you know. Though I can see you're a Westerner by your talk. What's a lot of New England ships used to have to do with the queer ports in Africa, Asia and the South Seas and everywhere else. And what queer kinds of people they sometimes brought back with them. You've probably heard about the Salem man that came home with a Chinese wife. And maybe you know there's still a bunch of Fiji Islanders somewhere around Cape Cod. Well, there must be something like that back of the Innsmouth people. The place always was badly cut off from the rest of the country by the marshes and creeks. And we can't be sure about the ins and outs in the matter. But it's pretty clear that the old Captain Marsh must have brought some odd specimens when they had all the 3 of his ships in the commission back in the 20s and 30s. There certainly is a strange kind of streak in Innsmouth folks today. I don't know how to explain it, but it sort of makes your skin crawl. You'll know it's a little insurgent if you take his bus. Some of them have queer, narrow heads, flat noses, and bulgy, starry eyes that never seem to shut. And their skin ain't quite right. Rough, scabby, and the sides of their necks are all shriveled and creased up. Get bald too, very young. The older fellows look the worst. Fact is, I don't even believe I've even seen a very old chap of that kind. Guess they must die of looking into a glass. Animals hate them. They used to have lots of horses. Trouble before autos came in. Nobody around here or Arkham or Ipswich will have anything to do with them. They act kind of offish themselves when they come to town or when anyone tries to fish on their grounds. Queer how fish are always stick off Innsmouth Harbour where there ain't anywhere else around. But just try to fish there yourself, and see how the folks chase you off. Those people used to come here on the railroad, walking and talking around the Rowley after a branch was dropped. And now they use our bus. Yeah, there's a hotel in Innsmouth called the Gilman House, but I don't believe it can amount to much. I wouldn't advise you try it. Better stay over there and take the 10 o'clock bus tomorrow morning. Then you can get an evening bus there for Arkham at 8 o'clock. There was a factory inspector who stopped at the Gilman a couple of years ago. He had a lot of unpleasant hints about the place. Seems that they got a queer crowd there for his fellow heard voices in rooms, though most of them were empty. I gave him the shivers. It was foreign talk, he thought, but he said the bad thing about it is that the kind of voice that sometimes spoke sounded so unnatural. Slopping, like he said. He didn't dare undress and go to sleep. Just waited up and let out the first thing in the morning. The talk went on mostly all night, apparently. This fellow, Casey his name was, had a lot to say about Innsmouth. Folks watched him and seemed to kind of, well, on guard. He found the Marsh refinery a queer place. It's an old mill on the lower falls of Manuex. And he said, tailed up with that, what I heard. Books in bad shape and no clear account of any kind of dealings. You know, it's always been a kind of mystery where the Marshes get their gold they refine. They never seem to do much buying in that line, but years ago they shipped out an enormous lot of ingots. Used to be talk of queer foreign kind of jewellery that the sailors and refinery sometimes sold on the sly. Or that was seen once or twice on the Marsh women folks. People allowed maybe old Captain Obed traded for it for some heathen pull, especially since he was always ordering stacks of glass beads and trinkets such as a seafaring men used to get for a native trade. Others thought and still think he'd found an old pirate cache out on Devil's Reef. But here's the funny thing. The old captain's been dead 60 years, and there ain't been a good-sized ship out of that place since the Civil War. But just the same as the Marshes, still keep on buying a few of those native trade things. Mostly glass and rubber gewgaws, and they tell me. Maybe the Innsmouth folk like 'em to look at themselves. God knows they've gotten to be about as bad as South Sea cannibals and Guinea savages. That plague of 46 must have taken off the best blood in the place. Anyway, they're a doubtful lot now, and the Marshes and the other rich folk are as bad as any. As I told you, there's probably ain't more than 400 people in the whole town. And in spite of all the new streets that they say there are, I guessed they are what they call white trash down south. Lawless and sly, full of secret doings. They get a lot of fish and lobsters and do exporting by truck. Queer how the fish swam right there and nowhere else. Nobody can ever keep a track of these people in the state of school officials and census men of devil of a time. You can bet that prying strangers ain't welcome around Innsmouth. I've heard personally of more than one business or government man that's disappeared there, and loose talk of one who went crazy and is at Danvers now. They must have fixed up some awful scare for that fellow. That's why I wouldn't go at night if I was you. I've never been there, and I've no wish to go, but I guess a daytime trip couldn't hurt you. Even though the people hereabouts would advise you not to make it. If you're just sightseeing and looking for old time stuff, Innsmouth ought to be quite a place for you. And so I spent part of that evening in Newburyport Public Library looking up the data about Innsmouth. When I had tried to question the natives in the shops and the lunchrooms and the garages and the fire stations, I had found them even harder to get started than the ticket agent had predicted, and realized that I could not spare the time to overcome their first instinctive reticences. They had a kind of obscure suspiciousness, as if there was something amiss with anyone too much interested in Innsmouth. At the YMCA where I was stopping, the clerk merely discouraged my going to such a dismissal decadent place, and the people at the library shelled me with much the same attitude. Clearly, in the eye of the educated, Innsmouth was merely an exaggerated case of civic degeneration. The Essex County histories on the library shelves had very little to say except that the town was founded in 1643 and noted for shipbuilding before the Revolution, a seat of great marine prosperity in the early 19th century, and later a minor factory centre using the Manuet's power. The epidemic and riots of 1846 were sparsely treated, as if they formed a discredit to the county. References to decline were few, though the significance of the later record was unmistakable. After the Civil War, all industrial life was confined to the marsh. Refining company and the marketing of gold ingots formed the only remaining bit of major commerce, aside from the eternal fishing. That fishing paid less and less as the price of commodity fell, and large-scale corporations offered competition. But there was never a dearth of fish around Innsmouth Harbour. Foreigners seldom settled there, and there was some discreetly veiled evidence that a number of Poles and Portuguese who had tried it had been scattered in a peculiarly drastic fashion. Most interesting of all was a glancing reference to the strange jewellery vaguely associated with Innsmouth. It had evidently impressed the whole countryside more than a little, for mention was made of specimens in the museum of the Miskatonic University at Arkham, and in the display room of the Newburyport Historical Society. The fragmentary descriptions of these things were bald and prosaic, but they hinted to me an undercurrent of persistent strangeness. Something about them seemed so odd and provocative that I could not put them out of my mind. And despite the lateness of the hour, I resolved to see the local sample. Said to be a large and queerly proportioned thing, evidently meant for a tiara, if it could possibly be arranged. The librarian gave me a note of introduction to the curator of the society, a Miss Anna Tilton, who lived nearby, and after a brief explanation the ancient gentlewoman was kind enough to pilot me into the closed building, since the hour was not outrageously late. The collection was a notable one indeed, but in my persistent mood, I had eyes for nothing but the bizarre object which glistened in a corner of a cupboard under the electric lights. It took no excess sensitiveness to beauty to make me literally gasp at the strange, unearthly splendour of the alien, opulent fantasy that rested there on a purple velvet cushion. Even now I can hardly describe what I saw, though it was clearly enough a sort of tiara, as the description had said. It was tall in front, and with a very large curiosity and irregular periphery, as if designed for a head of almost freakishly elliptical outline. The material seemed to be predominantly gold, though a weird lighter lustrousness hinted at some strange alloy with an equally beautiful and scarcely identifiable metal. Its condition was almost perfect, and one could have spent hours in studying the striking and puzzlingly untraditional designs, some simple, geometrical, and some plainly marine, chased or moulded in high relief on its surface with a craftsmanship of incredible skill and grace. The longer I looked, the more the thing fascinated me, and in this fascination there was a curiously disturbing element, hardly to be classified or accounted for. At first I decided that it was the queer, otherworldly quality of the art which made me uneasy. All the other art objects I had ever seen either belonged to some known racial or national stream, or else were consciously modernistic defiances of every recognized stream. This tiara was neither. It clearly belonged to some settled technique of infinite maturity and perfection, yet that technique was utterly remote from any Eastern or Western, ancient or modern, which I had ever heard of or seen exemplified. It was as if the workmanship were that of another planet. However, I soon saw that my uneasiness had a second and perhaps equally potent source residing in the pictorial mathematical suggestions of the strange design. The patterns all hinted of a remote secrets and unimaginable abysses in time and space. The monotonous aquatic nature of reliefs became almost sinister. Among these reliefs were fabulous monsters of abhorrent grotesqueness and malignity, half etheric and half Batrachian, in suggestion which one could not dissociate from a certain haunting and uncomfortable sense of pseudo-memory, as if they called up some image from the deep cells and tissues whose retentive functions are wholly primal and awesomely ancestral. At times, I fancied that every contour of these blasphemous fish frogs was overflowing with the ultimate quintessence of the unknown and inhuman evil. In odd contrast to the tiara's aspect was its brief and prosy history, as related by Miss Tilton. It had been pawned for a ridiculous sum at a shop in State Street in 1873 by a drunken Innsmouth man, shortly afterward killed in a brawl. The society had acquired it directly from the pawnbroker, at once giving it a display worthy of its quality. It was labelled as a probable East Indian or Indo-Chinese province, though the attribution was frankly tentative. Miss Tilton, comparing all possible hypotheses regarding its origin and its presence in New England, was inclined to believe that it formed part of some sort of exotic pirate horde discovered by old Captain Obadiah Marsh. This view was surely not weakened by the insistent offers of purchase at a higher price, which the Marshes began to make soon as they knew of its presence, and which they repeated to this day, despite the society's unvarying determination not to sell. As the good lady showed me out of the building, she made it clear that the pirate theory of the Marsh fortune was popular one among the intelligent people of the region. Her own attitude toward Shadow Over Innsmouth, which she had never seen, was one of disgust at the community slipping so far down the cultural scale, and she assured me that the rumours of devil worship were partly justified by a peculiar secret cult which had gained force there and engulfed all the orthodox churches. It was called, she said, the Esoteric Order of Dagon, and was undoubtedly a debased quasi-pagan thing imported from the East a century before, at a time when the Innsmouth fisheries seemed to be going barren. Its persistence among simple people were quite natural in view of a sudden and permanent return of abundantly fine fishing, and it soon became to be the greatest influence on the town, replacing Freemasonry altogether and taking up headquarters in the old Mezanaic Hall on the new church green. All this, to pious Miss Tilton, formed an excellent reason for shunning the ancient town of decay and desolation, but to me it was merely a fresh incentive. To my architectural and historical anticipations was now added an acute anthropological zeal, and I could scarcely sleep in my small room at the Y as the night wore away. Chapter 2. Shortly before 10 the next morning, I stood with one small valise in front of Hammond's drugstore in the old market square, waiting for the Innsmouth bus. As the hour for its arrival drew near, I noticed a general drift of the loungers to other places up the street, or to the ideal lunch across the square. Evidently, the ticket agent had not exaggerated the dislike which local people bore towards Innsmouth and its denizens. In a few moments, a small motor coach of extreme decrepitude and dirty grey colour rattled down State Street, made a turn and drop at the curb beside me. I felt immediately that it was the right one. I guess which was half illegible sign on the windshield. Arkham, Innsmouth, Newburyport. Soon verified. There were only 3 passengers, dark unkempt men of sullen visage and somewhat youthful cast. And when the vehicle stopped, they clumsily shambled out and began walking up State Street in a silent, almost furtive fashion. The driver also alighted, and I watched him as he went into the drugstore to make some purchase. This, I reflected, must be the Joe Sargent mentioned by the ticket agent. And even before I noticed any details, there spread over me a wave of spontaneous aversion, which could be neither checked nor explained. It suddenly struck me as very natural that the local people should not wish to ride on the bus owned by and driven by this man, or to visit any oftener than possible the habitat of such a man and his kinsfolk. When the driver came out of the store, I looked at him more carefully and tried to determine the source of my evil impression. He was thin, stoop-shouldered man, not much under 6 feet tall, dressed in a shabby blue civilian clothes and wearing frayed grey golf cap. His age was perhaps 35, but the odd, deep creases in the side of his neck made him seem older. When he did not study his dull, expressionless face, he had a narrow head, bulging, watery blue eyes that seemed to never wink, a flat nose, a receding forehead and chin, and singularly undeveloped ears. His long, thick lip and coarse-pored greyish cheeks seemed almost beardless, except for some sparse yellow hairs that straggled and curled in irregular patches, and in places the surface seemed queerly irregular, as if peeling from some cutaneous disease. His hands were large and heavily veined, and had a very unusual greyish-blue tinge. The fingers were strikingly short in proportion to the rest of the structure, and have seemed to have a tendency to curl closely into the huge palm. As he walked towards the bus, I observed his peculiarly shambling gait, and saw that his feet were inordinately immense. The more I studied them, the more I wondered how he could buy any shoes to fit them. A certain greasiness about the fellow increased my dislike. He was evidently given to working or lounging around the fish stocks, and carried with him much of their characteristic smell. Just what foreign blood was in him? I could not even guess. His oddity certainly did not look Asian, Polynesian, Levantine. Yet I could see why people found him alien. I myself would have thought of the biological degeneration rather than alienage. I was sorry when I saw that there would be no other passengers on the bus. Somehow I did not like the idea of riding alone with this driver. But as leaving time obviously approached, I conquered my qualms and followed the man aboard, extending him a dollar bill and murmuring the single word, Innsmouth. He looked curiously at me for a second, as he returned 40 cents change without speaking. I took a seat far behind him, but on the same side of the bus, since I wished to watch the shore during this journey. At length, the decrepit vehicle started with a jerk and rattled noisily past the old brick buildings of State Street amidst a cloud of vapour from the exhaust. Glancing at people on the sidewalks, I thought I detected in them a curious wish to avoid looking at the bus, or at least a wish to avoid seemingly to look at it. Then we turned to the left into High Street, where the going was smoother, flying by stately old mansions of the early Republic and still older colonial farmhouses, passing the Lower Green and Parker River, and finally emerging into a long, monotonous stretch of open shore country. The day was warm and sunny, but the landscape of sand and sedge grass and Stunted shrubbery became more and more desolated as we proceeded. Out of the window I could see blue water and the sandy line of Plum Island, and we presently drew very near the beach as our narrow road veered off from the main highway to Rowley and Ipswich. There were no visible houses, and I could tell by the state of the road that traffic was very light hereabouts. The small weather-worn telephone poles carried only 2 wires. Now and then we crossed a crude wooden bridge over tidal creeks that wound far inland and promoted the general isolation of the region. Once in a while I noticed dead stumps and crumbling foundation walls above the drifting sand, and recalled the old tradition quoted in one of the histories I had read, that this was once a fertile and thickly settled countryside. The change, it was said, came simultaneously with the Innsmouth epidemic of 1846, and was thought by simple folk to have a dark connection with hidden forces of evil. Actually, it was caused by the unwise cutting of woodlands near the shore, which robbed the soil of its best protection and opened way for the waves and wind-blown sand. At last we lost sight of Plum Island, and saw the vast expanse of open Atlantic on our left. Our narrow course began to climb steeply, and I felt a singular sense of disquiet in looking at the lonely crest ahead, where the rutted roadway met the sky. It was as if the bus were about to keep on its ascent, leaving the sane earth altogether and emerging with the unknown arcana of the upper air and cryptical sky. The smell of the sea took on an ominous implication, and the silent driver's bent, rigid back and narrow head became more and more hateful. As I looked at him, I saw the back of his head was almost hairless as his face, having only a few straggling yellow strands upon a grey, scabrous surface. Then we reached the crest and passed an outspread valley beyond where the Manuet joins the sea, north of the long line of the cliffs that culminate in Kingsport Head, and veered off toward Cape Ann. On far the misty horizon I could just make out the dizzy profile of the head, topped by the queer ancient house of which so many legends are told. But for the moment all my attention was captured by the nearer panorama just below me. I realized, come face to face with the rumour shadowed Innsmouth. It was a town of wide extent and a dense construction, yet one with a portentous dearth of visible life. From the tangle of chimney pots scarcely a wisp of smoke came, and the 3 tall steeples loomed stark and unpainted against the seaward horizon. One of them was crumbling down at the top, and in that another there were only black gaping holes where clock dials should have been. The vast huddle of sagging gambrel roofs and peaked gables conveyed with offensive clearness the idea of a wormy decay as we approached along the now descending road. I could see that many roofs had wholly caved in. There were some large square Georgian houses too, with hipped roofs and cupolas and railed widows' walks. These were mostly well back from the water, and 1 or 2 seemed to be in moderately sound condition. Stretching inland from among them I saw the rusted grass-grown line of the abandoned railway, with leaning telegraph poles now devoid of wires, and the half-obscured lines of the old carriage road to Rowley and Ipswich. The decay was worse close to the waterfront, though in its very midst I could spy the white belfry of a fairly well-preserved brick structure which looked like a small factory. The harbour, long clogged with sand, was enclosed by an ancient stone breakwater, on which I could begin to discern the minute forms of a few seated fishermen, and at Hugh's End were what looked like the foundations of a bygone lighthouse. A sandy tongue had formed inside the barrier. Upon it I saw a few decrepit cabins and scattered lobster pots. The only deep water seemed to be where the river poured out past the belfried structure and turned southward to join the ocean at Breakwater's End. Here and there the ruins of wharves jutted out from the shore, to end in an indeterminate rottenness, those farthest south from seeing the most decayed, And far out at sea, despite a high tide, I glimpsed a long black line scarcely rising above the water, yet carrying a suggestion of an old latent malignancy. This, I knew, must be Devil's Reef. As I looked, a subtle, curious sense of beckoning seemed superadded to the grim repulsion, and oddly enough, I found this overtone more disturbing than the primary impression. We met no one on the road, but presently began to pass deserted farms in varying stages of ruin. Then I noticed a few inhabited houses with rags stuffed in the broken windows and shells of dead fish lying about the littered yards. Once or twice I saw listless-looking people working in barren gardens or digging clams on the fishy-smelling beach below, and groups of dirty simian-visaged children playing around in weed-grown doorsteps. Somehow these people seemed more disquieting than the dismal buildings, for almost every one had certain peculiarities of face and motions which I instinctively disliked without being able to define or comprehend them. For a second I thought this was the typical physique suggested some picture I had seen, perhaps in a book under circumstances of particular horror or melancholy, but this pseudo-recollection passed very quickly. As the bus reached a lower level, I began to catch the steady note of the waterfall throughout the unnatural stillness. The leaning, unpainted houses grew thicker, lined both sides of the road, and displayed more urban tendencies than did those we were leaving behind. The panorama ahead had contracted to a street scene, and in the spots I could see where a cobblestone pavement and stretches of brick sidewalk had formerly existed. All the houses were apparently deserted, and there were occasional gaps where tumbled-down chimneys and cellar walls told of buildings that had collapsed. Pervading everything was the most nauseous, fishy odour imaginable. Soon cross streets and junctions began to appear, those on the left leading to shoreward realms of unpaved squalor and decay, while those on the right showed vistas of departed grandeur. So far I had seen no people in the town, but there now came signs of sparse habitation. Curtained windows here and there, and the occasional battered motor car at the curb. Pavement and sidewalks were increasingly well defined, and though most houses were quite old, wooden brick structures of the early 19th century, they were obviously kept fit for habitation. As an amateur antiquarian, I lost my olfactory disgust and my feeling of menace and repulsion amidst this rich, unaltered survival for the past. But I was not to reach my destination without one very strong impression of poignantly disagreeable quantity. The bus had come to a sort of open concourse of radial point, with churches on two sides and bedraggled remains of a circular green in the centre. I was looking at the large pillared hall on the right-hand junction ahead. The structure's once white paint was now grey and peeling, and the black and gold sign of the pediment was so faded that I could only with difficulty make out the words Esoteric Order of Dagon. This then was the former Mezzanaic Hall, now given over to a degraded cult. As I strained to decipher this inscription, my notice was distracted by the rancious tones of a cracked bell across the street, and I quickly turned to look out my window on my side of the coach. The sound came from a squat towered stone church of a manifestly later date than most of these houses, built in a clumsy Gothic fashion and having disproportionately high basement with shuttered windows. Though the hands of its clocks were missing on the side I glimpsed, I knew that the hoarse strokes were telling the hour of 11. Then suddenly all thoughts of time were blotted out by an unrushing image of sharp intensity and uncountable horror which had seized me before I knew what it really was. The door of the church basement was open, revealing a rectangle of blackness inside, and as I looked a certain object crossed or seemed to cross the dark rectangle, burning into my brain A momentary conception of nightmare, which was all the more maddening because analysis could not show a single nightmarish quality in it. It was a living object, the first except the driver that I had seen entering the compact part of town, and had I been in a steadier mood, I would have found nothing whatever terror in it. Clearly, as I realized a moment later, it was the pastor, clad in some peculiar vestments, doubtless introduced since the Order of Dagon had modified the ritual of the local churches. The thing which had probably caught my first subconscious glance and supplied the touch of bizarre horror was the tall tiara he wore, almost an exact duplicate of the one Miss Tilton had shown me in the previous evening. This, acting on my imagination, had supplied namelessly sinister qualities to the intermediate face and robe shambling from beneath it. There was not, I soon decided, any reason why I should have felt that shuddering touch of evil pseudo-memory. Was it not natural that a local mystery cult should adopt among its regimentals a unique type of headdress, made familiar in a community in some strange way? Perhaps a treasure trove? A thin sprinkling of repellent-looking youngish people now became visible on the streets. Lone individuals and silent knots of 2 or 3, the lower floors of crumbling houses sometimes harboured small shops with dingy signs. I noticed a parked truck or two as we rattled along. The sound of waterfalls became more and more distinct, and presently as I saw a fairly deep river gorge ahead, spanned by a wide iron-railed highway bridge beyond which a large square opened out. As we clanked over the bridge, I looked out on both sides, observed some factory buildings on the edge of the grassy bluff, or partway down. The water far below was very abundant, and I could see 2 vigorous sets of falls upstream on my right, at least one downstream on my left. From this point, the noise was quite deafening. Then we rolled into a large semicircular square across the river and drew up the right-hand side in the front of a tall cupola-crowned building with remnants of yellow paint and with a half-affected sign proclaiming it to be the Gilman House. I was glad to get out of that bus and once proceeded to check my valise in the shabby hotel lobby. There was only one person in sight, an elderly man without what I had come to call the Innsmouth look, and I decided not to ask him any of the questions which bothered me, remembering that odd things had been noticed in this hotel. Instead, I strolled out of the square from which the bus had already gone, and studied the scene minutely and appraisingly. One side of the cobblestone open space was a straight line of the river. The old was a semicircle of aslant-roofed bricked buildings of about the 1800 period, from which several streets radiated away to the southeast, south, and southwest. Lamps were depressingly few and small, and low-powered incandescents. I was so glad that my plans called for departure before dark, even though I knew the moon would be bright. The buildings were all in a fair condition, and included perhaps a few dozen shops in current operation, of which one was a grocery of the first national chain, others a dismal restaurant, a drugstore, and a wholesale fish dealer's office, and still another at the eastern extremity of the square near the river, an office of the town's only industry, the Marsh Refining Company. There were perhaps 10 people visible, and 4 or 5 automobiles and motor trucks stood scattered about. I did not need to be told that this was civic centre of Innsmouth. Eastward I could catch blue glimpses of the harbour, against which rose the decaying remains of 3 once beautiful Georgian steeples, and towards the shore of an opposite bank of the river I saw the white belfry surmounting what I took to be the Marsh Refinery. For some reason or another, I chose to make my first inquiries at the chain grocery, whose personnel was not likely to be native at Innsmouth. I found a solitary boy of about 17 in charge, and was pleased to note the brightness and affability which promised cheerful information. He seemed exceptionally eager to talk, and I soon gathered that he did not like the place, its fishy smell or its furtive people. A word with any outsider was a relief to him. He hailed from Arkham, boarded with a family who came from Ipswich, and went back home whenever he got a moment off. His family did not like him to work in Innsmouth, but the chain had transferred him there, and he did not wish to give up his job. There he was, he said. No public library or chamber of commerce in Innsmouth, but I could probably find my way about. The street I had come down was Federal West. Of that were the fine old residence streets, Broad, Washington, Lafayette, and Adams, and east of it were the Shorewood slums. It was in these slums along Main Street that I would find the old Georgian churches, but they were all long abandoned. It would be well not to make oneself too conniptious in such neighbourhoods, especially north of the river, since people were sullen and hostile. Some strangers had even disappeared. Certain spots were almost forbidden territory, as he had learned at a considerable cost. One must not, for example, linger much around the Marsh Refinery, or around any of the still-used churches, or around the pillared Order of Dagon Hall at New Church Green. Those churches were very odd, and all violently disavowed by the representative demonations of elsewhere, and apparently using the queerest kind of ceremonials and clerical vestments. Their creeds were heterodox and mysterious, involving hints of a certain marvellous transformations leading to bodily immortality of a sort on this earth. The youth's own pastor, Dr. Wallace of Absurdity in Emmy Church of Arkham, had gravely urged him not to join any church in Innsmouth. As for the Innsmouth people, the youth hardly knew what to make of them. They were as furtive as seldom as seen as animals that live in burrows, and one could hardly imagine how they passed the time apart from the desultory fishing. Perhaps, judging from the quantities of bootleg liquor they consumed, they lay for most of the daylight hours in an alcoholic stupor. They seemed sullen banded together in some sort of fellowship and understanding, despising the world as if they had access to another and preferable spheres of entity. Their appearance, especially those staring, unwinking eyes which one never saw shut, was certainly shockingly enough, and their voices were disgusting. It was awful to hear them chanting in their churches at night, and especially during the main festivals or revivals, which fell twice a year on the April 30th and October 31st. They were very fond of the water and swam a great deal in both river and harbour. Swimming races out to Devil's Reef were very common, and everyone in the sight seemed well able to share this absurdest sport. When one came to think of it, it was generally only rather young people who were seen about in public, and of the oldest were apt to be most tainted looking. With exceptions did occur, there were mostly persons with no trace of aberrancy, looked like the old clerk at the hotel. One wondered what became of the bulk of the older folk, whether the Innsmouth look were not a strange, insidious disease phenomenon, which increased its hold as the years advanced. Only a very rare affliction, of course, could bring about such a vast and radical anatomical changes in a single individual after maturity, changes involving serious factors as basic as the shape of the skull, but then even this aspect was no more baffling and unheard of than the visible features of the malady as a whole. It would be hard, the youth implied, to form any real conclusions regarding such a matter, since one never came to know the native personally, no matter how long one might live in Innsmouth. The youth was certain that many specimens even worse than the worst visible ones were kept locked indoors in some places. People sometimes heard the queerest kinds of sounds. The tottering waterfront hovels north of the river were reputedly connected by hidden tunnels, being thus veritable warrens of the unseen abnormalities. What kind of foreign blood, if any, these beings had, it was impossible to tell. They sometimes kept a certain especially repulsive characters out of sight when government agents and other outsiders came to town. It would be of no use, my informant said, to ask the natives anything about the place. The only one who would talk was a very aged but normal-looking man who lived in the poorhouse at the north of the rim of the town, and spent his time walking about or lounging around the fire station. This hoary character, Zadlock Allen, was 96 years old, and somewhat touched in the head. Besides being the town drunkard, he was a strange, furtive creature who constantly looked over his shoulder as if he was afraid of something, and when sober he could not be swayed to talk at all with strangers. He was, however, unable to resist any offer of his favourite poison, and when drunk would furnish the most astonishing fragments of wished reminiscence. After all, though little useful data could be gained from him, since his stories were all insane, incomplete hints of the impossible marvels and horrors which could have no source save in his own disordered fancy, nobody ever believed him. But the natives did not like him to drink and talk with strangers, and it was not always safe to be seen questioning him. It was probably from him that some of the wildest popular whispers of delusion were derived. Several non-native residents had reported monstrous glimpses from time to time. Between old Zadlock's tales and the malformed denizens, it was no wonder such illusions were current. None of the non-natives ever stayed out late at night, there being a widespread impression that it was not wise to do so, besides the streets were loathsomely dark. As for business, the abundance of fish was certainly almost uncanny, but the natives were taking less and less advantage of it. Moreover, prices were falling and competition was growing. Of course, the town's real business was the refinery, whose commercial office was on the square only a few doors east of where we stood. Old Man Marsh was never seen, but sometimes went to the works in a closed curtain car. There were all sorts of rumours about how Marsh had come to look. He had once been a great dandy, and people said he still wore frock-coated finery of the Edwardian age, curiously adapted to certain deformities. His sons had formerly conducted the office in the square, but latterly they had been keeping out of sight a good deal and leaving the brunt of the affairs to the younger generation. The sons and their sisters had come to look very queer, especially the elder ones. It was said that their health was failing. One of the Marsh daughters was a repellent, reptilian-looking woman who wore an excess of weird jewellery, clearly of the same exotic tradition as that to which the strange tiara belonged to. My informant had noticed it many times, and had heard it spoken of as a coming from the secret horde, either of pirates or of demons. The clergymen or priests, or whatever they were called nowadays, also wore this kind of ornament as a headdress, but there seldom caught glimpses of them. Other specimens the youth had not seen, though many were rumoured to exist in Innsmouth. The Marshes, together with the other three gently bred families of the town, the Wights, the Gilmans, the Elliots, were all very retiring. They lived in immense houses along Washington Street, and several were reputed to the harbour and consummate certain living kinsfolk, whose personal aspect forebode public view, whose deaths had been reported and recorded. Warning me that many of the street signs were down, the youth drew, for my benefit, a rough but ample painstaking sketch map of the town's salient features. After a moment's study, I felt sure that it would be of great help, and I pocketed it with profuse thanks. Disliking the dinginess of the single restaurant I had seen, I had bought a fair supply of cheese crackers and ginger wafers to serve as lunch later on. My programme, I decided, would be to thread principal streets, talk with any non-natives I may encounter, and catch the 8 o'clock coach for Arkham. The town, I could see, formed a significant and exaggerated example of communal decay, but being no sociologist, I would limit any serious observations to the field of architecture. Thus I began my systematic, though half-bewildered, tour of Innsmouth's narrow, shadow-blighted ways. Crossing the bridge and turning toward the road of the lower falls, I passed close to the Marsh Refinery, which seemed oddly free from the noise of industry. This building stood on the steep river bluff near a bridge, an open confluence of streets which I took to be the earliest civic centre, displaced after dissolution by the present town square. Recrossing the gorge on the Main Street Bridge, I struck a region of utter desertation, which somehow made me shudder. Collapsing huddles of gambrel roofs formed a jagged and fantastic skyline above which rose the ghoulish decapitated steeple of an ancient church. Some houses along Main Street were tenanted, but most were tightly boarded up. Down unpaved side streets, I saw the black gaping windows of deserted hovels, many of which leaned at perilous and incredible angles through the sinking of the part of the foundations. Those windows stared so spectrally that it took courage to turn them eastward towards the waterfront. Certainly the terror of a deserted house swells in the geometrical rather than the astrometrical progression as a house multiply into form of city of a stark desolation. The sight of such an endless avenues of fish-eyed vacancy and death, and the thought of such linked infinities of black brooding compartments given over to cobwebs and memories, and the conqueror warm start of vestigial fears and aversion that not even the stoutest philosopher could even disperse. Fish Street was as deserted as Main, though it differed in having many brick and stone warehouses still in excellent shape. Water Street was almost its duplicate, save that there were the great seaward gaps where the wharves had been. Not a living thing did I see except from the scattered fishermen on the distant breakwater, and not a sound did I hear save the lapping of the harbour tides and the roar of the falls in the minuet. The town was getting more and more on my nerves, and I looked behind me furtively as I picked my way back over the tottering Water Street Bridge. The Fish Street Bridge, according to the sketch, was in complete ruins. North of the river there were traces of squalid life, active fishing packing houses in the Water Street, smoking chimneys and patched roofs here and there. Occasional sounds from the intermediate sources and infrequent shambling forms in the dismal streets of unpaved lanes. But I seem to find this even more oppressive than southerly desertation. For one thing, the people were more hideous and abnormal than those near the centre of town, so that I was several times evilly reminded of something utterly fantastic which I could not quite place. Undoubtedly the alien strain in Innsmouth folk was stronger here than farther inland, unless, indeed, the Innsmouth look were a disease rather than a blood strain, in which case this district might be held to the harbour and more advanced cases. One detail that annoyed me was the distribution of a few faint sounds I heard. They ought naturally to have come wholly from the visible inhabited houses, yet in reality were often strongest inside the most rigidly boarded up facades. There was creaking, scurryings, and hoarse, doubtful noises, and I thought uncomfortably about the hidden tunnel suggested by the grocery boy. Suddenly I found myself wondering what the voices of those denizens would be like, and I had no speech so far in this quarter, and was unaccountably anxious not to do so. Pausing only long enough to look at two fine but ruinous old churches at Main and Church Street, I hastened out of the vile waterfront slum. My next logical goal was New Church Green, but somehow or another I could not bear to repass the church, in whose basement I had glimpsed the explicitly frightened form of the strangely diademed priest or pastor. Besides, the grocery youth had told me that churches, as well as the Order of Dagon Hall, were not advisable neighbourhoods for strangers. Accordingly, I kept north along Main to Martin, then turning inland, crossing Federal Street safely north of Green, and entering the decayed patrician neighbourhood of Northern Broad, Washington, Lafayette, and the Adams Streets. Though these staely old avenues were ill-surfaced and unkempt, their elm-shaded dignity had not entirely departed. Mansion after mansion claimed my gaze, most of them decrepit and boarded up, amidst neglected grounds, but one or two in each street showing signs of occupancy. In Washington Street there are a row of 4 or 5 in excellent repair with finely tended lawns and gardens. The most sumptuous of these, with wide terrace partners extending back the whole way to Lafayette Street, I took to be the home of Old Man Marsh, the afflicted refinery owner. In all these streets no living thing was visible. I wondered at the complete absence of cats and dogs from Innsmouth. Another thing which puzzled and disturbed me, even in some of the best preserved mansions, was the tightly shuttered condition of many third-story and attic windows. Furtiveness and secretness seemed universal in this hushed city of alienage and death. I could not escape the sensation of being watched from ambush and on every hand by sly, staring eyes that never shut. I shivered as the cracked stroke of 3 sounded from a belfry on my left. Too well did I recall the squat church from which those notes came from. Following Washington Street towards the river, I now faced a new zone of the former industry and commerce, noting the ruins of a factory ahead and seeing others with the old trace of the railway station and covered railway bridge beyond up the gorge on my right. The uncertain bridge now before me was posted with a warning sign, but I took the risk and crossed the bridge to the south bank, where traces of life reappeared. Furtive, shambling creatures stared cryptically in my direction, and more normal faces eyed me coldly and curiously. Innsmouth was rapidly becoming intolerable. I turned down Payne Street towards Square in the hope of getting some vehicle to take me to Arkham before the still distant staring time of that sinister bust. It was then I saw the tumbled-down fire station on my left. and noticed the red-faced, bushy-bearded and watery-eyed old man in nondescript rags who sat on a bench in front of it talking with a pair of unkempt but abnormal-looking firemen. This, of course, must be Zadlock Allen, the half-crazed licorice knowledgearian whose tales of old Innsmouth and his shadow were so hideous and incredible. Chapter 3. It must have been some imp of the perverse, or some sardonic pull from the dark, hidden sources which had made me change my plans as I did. I had long before resolved to limit my observations to architecture alone, and I was even then hurrying towards the square in an effort to get a quick transportation out of this festering city of death and decay. But the sight of old Zadok set up a new currents in my mind and made me slacken in my pace uncertainly. I had been assured that the old man could do nothing but hint at the wild, disjointed and incredible legends, and I had been warned that the natives made it unsafe to be seen talking to him, yet the thought of his aged witness to the town's decay with memories going back of the early days of ships and factories was a law that no amount of reason could make me resist. After all, the strangest and maddest of myths were merely symbols or allegories based upon the truth, and old Zadok must have seen everything which went on around Innsmouth for the last 90 years. Curiosity flared up beyond sense and caution, and in my youngful egotism, I fancied I might be able to sift the nucleus of real history from the confused, extravagant outpouring I would probably extract with the aid of raw whiskey. I knew that I could not accost him then and there, for the fireman would surely notice and object. Instead, I reflected, I would prepare by getting some bootleg liquor at a place where the grocery boy had told me it was plentiful. Then I would loaf near the fire station in apparent casualness, and fall in with old Zadok after he had started one of his frequent rambles. The youth said that he was very restless, seldom sitting around for the station for more than an hour or two at a time. A quart bottle of whiskey was easily, though not cheaply, obtained in the rear of a dingy variety store just off the square in Elliot Street. The dirty-looking fellow who waited on me had a touch of the staring Innsmouth look, but was quite civil in his way, being perhaps used to the custom of such convivial strangers, truckmen, gold buyers and the like, and was occasionally in town. Re-entering the square, I saw that luck was with me, for shuffling out of the Payne Street, around the corner of Gillam House, I glimpsed nothing less than the tall, lean, tattered form of old Zadok Allen himself. In accordance with my plan, I attracted his attention by brandishing my newly purchased bottle, and soon realized he had begun to shuffle wistfully after me as I turned into Wight Street, on my way to the most deserted region I could think of. I was steering my course by the map the grocery boy had prepared, and was aiming for a wholly abandoned stretch of the southern waterfront, which I had previously visited. The only people inside there had been the fishermen on the distant breakwater, and by going a few squares south I could get beyond the range of these. Finding a pair of seats on the abandoned wharf and being free to question old Zadok unobserved for an indefinite time. Before I reached Main Street I could hear a faint and wheezy "Hey, mister!" behind me. I presented aloud the old man to catch up and take a copious pulls from the quart bottle. I began putting out feelers as we walked along to Water Street and turned southward amidst the omnipresent desolation and crazily tilted ruins, but found that the aged tongue did not loosen as quickly as I expected. At length I saw a grass-grown opening toward the sea between crumbling brick walls, with the weedy length of an earthy masonry wharf projecting beyond. Piles of moss-covered stones near the water promised tolerable seats, and the scene was sheltered from all possible view by a ruined warehouse on the north. Here, I thought, was the ideal place for a long, secret colloquially, so I guided my companion down the lane and picked our spots to sit in amongst the mossy stones. The air of death and desolation was ghoulish, and the smell of fish almost insufferable, but I was resolved to let nothing deter me. About 4 hours remained for our conversation if I were to catch the 8 o'clock coach for Arkham, and I began to dole out more liquor to the ancient tippler, meanwhile eating my own frugal lunch. In my donations I was careful not to overshoot the mark, for I did not wish Zadok's vinous growliousness to pass into a stupor. After an hour his furtive taciturnity showed signs of disappearing, but much to my disappointment he still sidetracked my questions about Innsmouth and its shadow-haunted past. He would babble on current topics, revealing of a wide acquaintance with newspapers and a great tendency to philosophize in sententious village fashion. Toward the end of the second hour I feared my quart of whiskey would not be enough to produce results, and was wondering whether I had better leave old Zadok and go back for more. Just then, however, chance made the opening which my questions had been unable to make, and the wheezing ancient's rambling took a turn that caused me to lean forward and listen alertly. My back was toward the fishy-smelling sea, but he was facing it, and something or other had caused his wandering gaze to light on the low, distant line of Devil Reef, then showing plainly and almost fascinatingly above the waves. The sight seemed to displease him, for he began a series of weak curses which ended in confidential whisper and a knowing leer. He bent towards me, took a hold of my coat lapel, and hissed out some hints that could not be mistaken. "That's where it all began. This cursed place of wickedness, where the deep water starts. Gato Hill. Sheer drop down to the bottom now, sounding like Kintic. Oh, Cat and a Bow done it. Him that found out more was good for him than the South Sea Islands. Everybody was in a bad way them days. Trade falling off. Me was losing business, even the new ones. And that's the best of our men's folk. Killed or privateered in the War of 1812, or lost with the Eliza bringing a Ragnar Snow. Both on them, Gilman Ventners. Obadiah Marsh had 3 ships afloat: Brigantine Columby, Brigantine Hetty, and Bark Summitry Queen. He was the only one who kept on with the East Indies, the Pacific Trade. The Ezra Martin's Brigantine Malay Pride made a venter as nether in 28. Never was like anybody like Captain Obed. I'd live, oh Satan. I can't mind him telling about ferrying parts and calling old folks stupid for going to Christian meeting and bearing their burdens meek and lowly. Says they ought to get better gods or something like that. These folks in the Ingies, good as us, bringing them good fishing in return for their sacrifices, and their really answer for folks' prayers. Matt Elliot, his first mate, talked a lot, and he was aging for folks doing any heathen things. Told about it, island east of Atheti. But there were also a lot of stones ruined, older than anybody anything knew about. Kind of like those them on a Bonaparte in the Carolines, with carvings of faces that looked like big statues on Easter Island. There was a little volcanic island near there too, where there are other ruins with the different carvings. Ruins all the way, like been under the sea or something like that, with pictures of awful monsters all over him. Whoa. So Matty says the natives around here had all the fish they could catch. They sported bracelets and armlets and head rigs made of a queer kind of gold, covered with pictures of monsters just like the ones carved in the ruins on the little island. Sort of like fish-like frogs, or frog-like fishes, that was drawn in all kinds of positions, like they were human beings. And we could get out of them. They got all the stuff, and all the natives wondered how they managed to find them plenty, and even when the next islands had lean pickings. Matty had got to wondering too, and so did old Captain Obeded. Everybody noticed. Besides, that's lots of handsome young folks drop out of sight from year to year, and what they want, many old folks around. Also, he thinks some of the folks look darn queer, even fear the Kanakys. It took Obeded the truth out of them. No. It took Obeded to get the truth of them even. I don't know how he done it, but he had begun trading for the gold-like things they wore. Asked them where they came from, see if he could get any more of them. Finally wormed a story about the old chief, Wallachia, they called him. Nobody at Obedade could ever believe the old yellow devil, but the captain could read folks like they were books. Nobody believes me now when I tell them. I don't suppose you will you, young fella? They come to look at you. You kind of got them sharp reading eyes, old Obeded had. The old man's whisper grew fainter, and I found myself shuddering at the terrible and sincere preposterous of his intonation, even though I knew his tale could be nothing but drunken fantasy. Well, sir, Obeded had learned the things on this earth aren't, as most things never heard about them. Wouldn't believe what they did here. It seems these Kanakys were sacrificing heaps of their young men and maidens to some kind of god things that lived under the sea, and getting all sorts of favours in return. And they met the things on the little island with the queer ruins on it, and seen them also pictures of those awful frog-fish monsters were supposed to be pictures of these god things. Maybe they were the kind of critters all the mermaid stories and sets started from. They had all kinds of cities on the bottom of the sea, and this island was heaved up from there. Seems they were some of living things alive, and the stone buildings on the island come up all of a sudden to turn the surface. That's how the Kanakys got wind that they were down there. Made sign talk as soon as they got over being scared, and pieced up a bargain on off along. Them things like human sacrifices had them ages before, but lost track of the upper world after a time. What they done to their victims ain't for me to say, unless Obeded wasn't too sharp about asking. But it was alright with the heathens, because they'd been having a hard time or was desperate at everything. They gave me a certain number of young folks to see things twice every year. May, Eve, Halloween, regular as could be. Also give some of the carved knickknacks they made. What the things agreed to give in return was plenty of fish they'd have. They're driving them all over the sea. A few gold things now and then as well. Well, as I says, the natives met these things on the little volcanic islands, going there in the canoes with sacrifices and bringing back anything the gold like jewels was coming to them. At first these things never go on the main island. After a time they just came to want to. Seems they hankered after mixing with the folks and having jint ceremonies on the big day, May Eve, Halloween, you see. They were able to live in both in and out of the water. What they call amphibians, I guess. The Kanakys told them as how folks from the other islands might want to wipe them out if they got wind of them being there. But they says they don't keep here much, because they could wipe out a whole brood of humans if they were willing to bother. That's if any of them certain signs as which the old lost on. No. That is just have starting signs was on by the lost old ones, whoever they was. But not wanting to bother, they lay down anybody who visited the island. When it came to matting, with them toad-looking fishes, and the Kanaki kind of balked, but finally they learnt something as I put a new face on the matter. Seems like human folks kind of got a relation to such water beasts. That everything alive came out the water once, and only the little things changed to go back then. Them things told the Kanakys is that if they mixed bloods, their children would be human first, but then more and more as time went on, that the little things they turned like the fish frog things, till they finally take part in the water to join the main lot down there. And this is the important part, my fella. This is the really important part. Them as turned into fish things went into the water would never die. Them things never died except when they were killed violently. Well, sir, it seems by the time Obadiah knowed them islanders, they was full of fish blood from the deep water things. When they got an old begun to show it, they was kept high until they felt like taking to the water and quitting the place. Some was more touched than others, and others never did quite change enough to make it down to the water. But mostly they turned around just the same things said. Them as was born like the things they changed early, but them as nearly as human sometimes stayed in the island till they were past 70. Though they'd usually go down under for trial trips off all that. Folks as had took the water generally come back a good deal to visit, shows a man will often be taken to his own 5 times greater grandfather, who left the dry land a couple of 100 years ago or so for. Everyone go out to the idea of dying except in the canoe wars, when the other islanders or as sacrifices to the sea gods down below, or from snake bite plague or sharp galloping, elements of something before they could take to the water, but simply look forward to a kind of change that wasn't a bit horrible after a while. They thought they would get down as well. They'd have give up, and I guess Obadiah kind of came to think the same of himself when he chewed over Wakala's story for a bit. Wallachia, though, was one of the few, as he hadn't gone none of the fish blood, and being a royal line of intermarried with royal lines of the other islands. Wallachia, he showed Obadiah a lot of rites and incantations that had to do with the sea things. Let him see some of the folks in the village has changed a lot from the human shape. Somehow or another. He would never You'll never let him see one of the regular things right out of the water. In the end, he gave him a funny kind of thingamajig made out of lead or something. He said he'd bring up the fish things from any place in the water where there might be a nest of them. The idea was to drop it down right in a kind of prayers and such. Well, he allowed as the things were scattered all over the world, so that anybody looked about could find the nest and bring them up if they wanted. Matt, he didn't like business at all. Wanted Obadiah shut away from the island, but the captain was sharp for gain and found he could get them gold-like things so cheap he could pay him his specialty for them. Things went on that way for a few years, and Obadiah got enough gold-like stuff to help him start that refinery in Wight's old run-down fulfilling mill. He didn't dash to sell pieces as they were, for folks all the time be asking questions. All the same, his crew get a piece of dispose of it now and then. Even though they swore it to keep him up, and he let his woman folks wear some of the pieces was more human-like than most. Well, come about 38, when I was 7 years old, and Obed had found the island and people were wiped out between voyages. Seems the other islands had got wind of what's going on and had took matters into their own hands. Suppose they must have heard after all. Them old magic signs, as the sea things say, are the only things they were afraid of. No telling what any of those canakees will chance to get hold of the sea bottoms, throw up some islands with ruins older than Delurge. Pious cusses. These were. They didn't leave nothing standing there either on the main island or the little volcanic islet, except what parts of the ruins were too big to knock down. In some places there were little stones strewed about like charms with something on them, what you call swastikas nowadays. Probably them was old, well, probably one of them old one signs. Folks all wiped out, no trace, no gold-like things, and none nearby Canadies would breathe a word about the matter. Wouldn't even admit they'd been on the island. That naturally hit Obadiah pretty hard, seeing as his normal trade was doing very poor. It hit the whole of Innsmouth too, because of a seafaring days of which profited the masters, it generally profited the crew proportionate. Most of the folks around town took the hard times kind of sheep-like and resigned, but they were in bad shape because of the fishing. Was petering around the mills and what doing none too well. Then's the time when Obadiah he begun a cursing at the folks for being dull as praying to a Christian heaven as didn't help him none. He told him he'd known of folks and prayed to gods who'd given something you need, and says if a good bunch of men stand by him who could maybe get hold and start and powers is there's plenty of fish and quite a bit of gold. Of course, them as served as summatory queen and seed the island know what we meant, and weren't too anxious to get close to the sea things they've been told about. But then as they didn't know what 'twas all about, got kind of swayed by what Obadiah had to say and begun to ask him what he could do, set him on a way to find faith and bring him results. Here the old man faltered, mumbled and lapsed into a moody, apprehensive silence, glancing nervously over his shoulder and then turning back to stare fascinated at the distant black reef. When I spoke to him he did not answer, so I knew I would have to let him finish the bottle. The insane yarn I was hearing interested me profoundly, for I fancied there was contained within a sort of crude allegory based upon the strangeness of Innsmouth, and elaborated by an imagination at once creative and full of scraps of exotic legend. Not for a moment did I believe that the tale had any real substantial foundation, but nonetheless the account held a hint of genuine terror, if only because it brought in new references to strange jewels, clearly akin to the Malagan tiara I had seen at Newburyport. Perhaps the ornaments had, after all, come from a strange island, and possibly the wild stories were lines of the bygone Obadiah himself, rather than this antique toper. I handed Zadok the bottle, and he drained it down to the last drop. It was curious how he could stand so much whiskey, for not even a trace of thickness had come into his high, wheezy voice. He licked the nose of his bottle and slipped it into his pocket, then began to nod and whisper softly to himself. I bent close to catch any articulate words he might utter, and thought I saw a sardonic smile beyond the stained, bushy whiskers. Yes, he was really forming words, and I could grasp at a fair proportion of them. Poor Matt was always aging it, trying to line the folks up on his side. Long talks with the preachers, no use, no use. They ran the congregational pastor about out of town. The Methodist fella quit. Never did see the resolved Barbercock. The Baptist parson again, Wrath of Jehovah. I was a mighty little critter. But I heard what I heard and seen what I seen. Dagon, Astareth, Belial and Beelzebub, golden calf and his idols, canon to the Philistines, Babylonia's abominations. Mene, tackle Abisin. He stopped again, and from the look of his watery blue eyes I feared he was close to a stupor after all. But when I gently shook his shoulder, he turned on me with astonishing alertness and snapped out of some obscure phrases. Don't believe me, eh? Just tell me, young fella, why did Captain Overdead 20-odd folks used to row out to Devil's Reef in the dead of night, chanting so loud you could hear him all over town when the wind was right? Tell me that, eh? And tell me why Overdead was always dropping heavy things down in the water on the other side of the reef where the bottom shoots down like a cliff, lowering kin sound. Tell me what he had done with the funny-shaped thingamajig as what Kayla gave to him, eh, boy? And what did they all howl on May Eve and again on Halloween? While the new church parsons, fellas that used to be sayers, wear them queer robes and cover themselves with gold-like things over the rung, eh? The watery blue eyes were almost savage and maniacal now, and the dirty white beard bristled electrically. Old Zadok probably saw me shrink back, for he began to cackle evilly. Beginning to see now, eh? Maybe you'd like to bend me in a few days, and when I see things out at night from the sea, from the cupola top of my house. Oh, kin, I tell you, little pictures of big ears, and I wasn't missing nothing of what was gossiped about either. Captain Overbed and the folks out on the reef. How about the night I took my past ship's glass up to the cupola and see a reef bristling thick with shapes that drove off quick soon the moon riz. Hoping them folks was in a dory, but them shapes dove off the far side into the deep water and never came up. How do you like to little shaver along the cupola and watching shapes that wasn't human shapes? The old man was getting hysterical, and I began to shiver with a nameless alarm. He laid a gnarled claw on my shoulder, and it seemed that he was shaking. He was not altogether of that mirth. Suppose one night you'd seen something. Have you heard often of a dead story beyond the reef, and learned the next day a young fellow was missing from home? Hey? Did anybody see you? Heard of Hiram Gilliman again today? Nick Pierce? Lily Wight? Adoram Southwick? Henry Garrison, hey? Shapes talking sign language with their hands. Them as they had real hands. Well, sir, that was the time Obed had to get on his feet again. Folks see these 3 darters wearing a gold-like things nobody ever seen on them before. Smoke started coming about the refinery chimney. Other folks were prospering too. Fish began to swarm the harbour to fit to kill. And heaven knows what size cargoes we began to shot at New Berryport, Arkham and Boston. 'Twas then Obadiah got the old branch railroad and put it through. Some Kingsport fishermen heard about the catching and came up in sloops, but they were all lost. Nobody ever see him again. And just then the folks organised to the esoteric order of Dagon. I bought the Masonic Hall of the Cavalry Commander for it. Matt Elliott was a Mason again. The selling, but he dropped out of sight just then. Remember how I saying Obadiah was set on heaven things just like there was in Kanaka Isle. But I don't think he aimed for us to do any mixing nor raise the young'uns to make the water turn into fishes with eternal life. He wanted them gold things and was willing to pay heavy, I guess. The others were satisfied for a while. Come in 46, the town done some looking and thinking for itself. Too many folks missing. Too much wild preachery in the meeting of a Sunday. Too much talk about that reef. I guess I was done by a bit of telling, selecting Moray what I see from the Capolo. There was a party one night has followed Obadiah's crowd about the reef. I heard shots betwixt the dories. Next day Obadiah and thus 32 others were in a jail, with everybody wondering just what was it for. Just what he charged again. God, if anybody looked ahead, a couple of weeks later when nothing had been thrown into the sea for that long. Zadok was showing signs of fright and exhaustion, and I kept him. Zadok was showing signs of fright and exhaustion, and I didn't keep his silence for a while, though glancing apprehensively at my watch, the tide had turned and was coming in now, and the sound of the waves seemed to arouse him. I was glad of that tide, for a high water that fishy smell might not be so bad. Again, I strained to catch the whispers. That awful night, I seed them. I was up in the Capolo. Hordes of them. Swarms of them. All over the reef, swimming up the harbour into the Manuet. God, what happened in the streets of Innsmouth that night? They ratted out the door, but Pa wouldn't open. Then he come out the kitchen window with his musket to find a selector Murray and see what he could do. Mounds of the dead and the dying. Shots and screams shouting in the old square, in the town square, in the new church green. Jail throwed open. Proclamation. Treason. Called it the plague when the folks found half of their people missing. Nobody left him. Enjoying an old Obadiah. Them things are... Or else keep quiet. Never heard of my partner more. The old man was panting and perspiring profusely. His grip on my shoulder tightened. Everything's cleared up in the morning. But there was these traces. Obadiah, he kinder takes charge and says everything's going to be changed. Others will worship within the meeting time, the satin houses. He's got to entertain guests. They wanted to mix like they did with the Canyaks. He'd fear they didn't bound to stop him. Far gone was Obadiah, just like a crazy man of the subject. He says they bring us fish and treasure. Should have hankered earlier. Nothing was to be different around the outside. Only was his keep shy of strangers, and we knowed good for us. We all had taken oath Dagon, and later there was second and third oaths that some of us took on then. Some they'd help us with some special get a special reward as gold and such. No use for Balakin, for there were millions of them down under. They'd Ruther not start rising and wiping out humankind, but if they were grave away a force, they could do a lot towards just that. We didn't have them an old chance to cut them off like the folks in South Sea did, and other Kanakys would never give up their secrets. Yield up enough sacrifices, savage knickknacks and harbourage in the town when they wanted it. They'd let well enough known, wouldn't bother no strangers. There's my bed tales outside, and that is where they got prying. All in the band of the faithful order of Dagon, as the children should never die, but go back to Mother Hydra and Father Dagon. We all come from once. Cthulhu Fatagan Fana Makthala Cthulhu Ragan Fatang. Old Zadok was fast lapsing into stark raving, and I held my breath. Poor old soul. To what pitiful depths of hallucination had his liquor, plus his hatred of the decay, aliens and disease around him, brought that fertile, imaginative brain? He began to moan now, and tears were coursing down his channeled cheeks into the depths of his beard. God's what I've seen since I was 15 years old. Mene, Teklepsa. Folks says was missing. So kill yourselves. They mistold things. Arkham or Ipswich were such places they were all called crazy. You call them here around over God what I'd seen. They'd kill me a long ago for it if I'd known. Only I took the first second oath to Dagon. Oath and Obeded was so protected unless the jury of it provoked. I was doing things I knew and about deliberately. But I wouldn't take the third oath. I'd die rather than take that. It got worse around the Civil War time, when the children born since 46 began to grow up. Some of them it was that was afraid. Never did any prying after that awful night. Never saw one of them. Close in my life, that is, never no full-blooded one. I went into the war. Hadn't seen any guts since. I'd never come back. We settled away from here, but the folks wrote me things and wasn't so bad. I suppose was because the government must draft men in the Tour 63 after the war. It was just as bad again. People began to fall off. Mills and shops shut down and shippings began to stop. The harbour all choked up. Railway gave up. But they never stopped swimming in and out that river, that accursed reef of Satan. More and more attic windows got boarded up. And more noises were heard in the houses and wasn't supposed to have any limit. Weren't supposed to have anyone in them. Folks outside have their stories about us. Suppose you've heard plenty of the one coming in. What questions you ask? Stories about things that you'd seen now and then. About the queer jewellery. Still comes in and ain't quite right. All them gold-like things, pirate lootings, all the Innsmouth folks here. Throwing blood or something distempered or diseased like that. Besides, them that lives here show off as many strangers as they kin, and encourage the rest not to get very curious, specifically around night time. Beasts balk at the critters. Horses was muscles and mule, but when they got autos, that was alright. In 46, Captain Obeded took a second wife that nobody in the town had never seen. Some says he didn't want to, but was made to do by them he called in, and had 3 children by her. 2 disappeared young, but one gal has looked at anybody else, and was educated in Europe. Obeded finally got her married off by a trick to Arkham fella. Didn't suspect anything. But nobody outside will have nothing to do with Innsmouth folks now. Barnabas Marsh, that runs refinery now, and Obeded grandson with his first wife, son of once 5 for us, his eldest son. But his mother was one of them, and was never seen outdoors. Right now Barnabas He's about changed. Can't shut his eyes no more. He's all about the shape. They say he still wears clothes, but that he'll take to the water soon. Maybe he tried it already. They do sometimes go down for a little spells, and after for that they're good. Ain't been said about it in public for more than a year. Don't know how his poor wife must be feeling. She came from Ipswich. And I lynched Barnabas when he caught her 50-odd year ago. Her dead. He died in 78, and all the next generation is now gone now. The first wife's children dead, and the rest God knows. The sound of the incoming tide was now very insistent, and little by little it seemed to change the old man's mood. From the maudlin tearfulness to the watchful fear, he would pause now, and then renew those nervous glances over his shoulder or out towards the reef. And despite the wild absurdity of his tale, I could not help beginning to share his vague apprehensiveness. Zadok now grew shriller, and seemed to be trying to whip out his courage with a louder speech. Hey you! Why don't you say something? How would you like to be living in a town like this, with everything rotten and dying, boarded up monsters crawling and bleating and barking and hopping around the black cellars and attics everywhere you look and turn? How would you like to hear howling night after night when the churches and the old Dagon all? I know what's doing part of the howling. How would you like to hear what comes from the awful reef every Mary, Eve and Alleywoonmas and think that the old man's crazy, eh? Well, sir, let me tell you, that ain't the worst. Zadok was almost screaming now. The mad frenzy of his voice disturbed me more than I cared to own. Curse ye. Don't sit there staring at me with them eyes. I tell Obadiah Marsh, and he's got to stay there. In hell, I say, he's got to stay in hell. Can't get me now. I ain't nothing, nor told nobody nothing. Oh, you young fella. Well, if I hadn't told nothing yet, I'm going to now. No, you sit still. Listen to me, boy. This is what I never told nobody. I says I didn't know prying after that night, but I found things just the same. You want to know what the real horror is, hey? Well, it's this. It wasn't them finstishals he's done, but it's what they're going to do. They're bringing things up out of the water. And they're coming to the town, been doing it for a few years, stacking up entirely lately. Them houses north of the river between the Wicks and the water and main streets, it's full of them. Them devils. And what they brung. When they get ready, I say they get ready. Ever hear tell of a shoggoth? Do you hear me? Do you hear them things? I've seen one of them. The hideous suddenness and inhuman frightfulness of the human shriek almost made me faint. His eyes looking past toward the malodorous sea were positively staring from his head, while his face wore a mask of fear worthy of the Greek tragedy. His bony claw dug monstrously into my shoulder, and he made no motion as I turned my head to look at whatever he had glimpsed at. There was nothing I could see, only the incoming tide with perhaps one set of ripples more than local long-flung line of breakers. But now Zadok was shaking me, and I turned back to watch the melting of that fear-frozen face into a chaos-twitching eyelids. Mumbling gums presently in his voice came back, albeit as a trembling whisper. Get out of here! Get out of here! They've seen us. Get out of here for your life. Don't have another wave dashed against the loosening masonry of the bygone wharf. Change the ancient whisper. Before I could recover my scattered wits, he had relaxed his clutch on my shoulder, and I dashed wildly inward toward the street, reeling northward around the ruined warehouse wall. I glanced back at the sea, but there was nothing there, and when I reached the water street and looked along it toward the north, there was no remaining trace of Zadok Allen. Chapter 4. I can hardly describe the mood in which I was left by this harrowing episode. An episode at once mad and pitiful, grotesque and terrifying. Grocery boy had prepared me for it, yet the reality left me none the less bewildered and disturbed. Puerile though the story was, old Zadok's insane earnest and horror had communicated to me a mounting unrest which joined with my earlier sense of loathing for the town and its blight of intangible shadow. Later, I might sift the table and extract some nucleus of the historic allegory. Just now I wished to put it out of my head. The hour had grown perilously late. My watch said 7:15, and the Arkham bus left town square at 8, so I tried to keep my thoughts as neutral in practice as possible. Meanwhile, walking rapidly through the deserted streets of gaping roofs and leaning houses towards the hotel where I had checked in my valise and would find my bus. Though the golden light of the late afternoon gave the ancient roofs and decrepit chimneys an air of mystique loveliness and peace, I could help not glance over my shoulder now and then. I would surely be very glad to get out of this malodorous and fear-shadowed Innsmouth, and wish there was some other vehicle than a bus driven by that sinister-looking fellow sergeant. Yet I did not hurry too precipitately, for there are architectural details worth viewing at every silent corner, and I could easily, I calculated, cover the necessary distance in half an hour. Studying the grocery use map and seeking a route I had not traversed before, I chose Mars Street instead of State for my approach to Town Square. Near the corner of Fall Street I began to see scattered groups of furtive whisperers, and when I finally reached the square I saw that almost all the loiterers were congregated around the door of Gilman House. It seemed as if many bulging, watery, unwinking eyes looked oddly at me as I claimed my valise in the lobby, and I had hoped that none of these unpleasant creatures would be my fellow passengers on the coach. The bus, rather early, rattled in with 3 passengers, somewhat before 8, and an evil-looking fellow on the sidewalk muttered a few indistinguishable words to the driver. Sergeant threw out a mailbag and a roll of newspapers and entered the hotel, while the passengers, the same men whom I had seen arriving in Newburyport this morning, shambled to the sidewalk and exchanged some faint guttural words with the loafer in a language I could have sworn was not English. I boarded the empty coach and took the same seat I had taken before, but was hardly settled before Sergeant reappeared and began mumbling in a throaty voice of peculiar repulsiveness. I was, it appeared, in very, very bad luck. There had been something wrong with the engine, despite the excellent time from Newburyport, and the bus could not complete the journey to Arkham. No, it could not be possibly repaired that night. Nor was there any way of getting transportation out of Innsmouth, either to Arkham or anywhere else. Sergeant was sorry, but I would have to stop over at the Gilman. Probably the clerk would make the price easy for me, but there was nothing else to do. Almost dazed by this sudden obstacle and violently dreading the fall of night in this decaying and half-unlighted town, I left the bus, re-entered the hotel lobby, where the sullen, queer-looking night clerk told me I could have the room 428 on the next top floor. Large, but without any running water, for $1. Despite what I heard of this hotel in Newburyport, I signed the register, paid my $1, let the clerk take my valise, and followed the sour, solitary attendant up the creaking flights of stairs past the dusty corridors, which seemed wholly devoid of life. My room, a dismal rear one with 2 windows, and bare and cheap furnishings, overlooked a dingy courtyard, otherwise hemmed in by low, deserted brick blocks, and commanded a view of decrepit westward stretching roofs, with a marshy countryside beyond. At the end of the corridor was a bathroom, a discouraging relique with an ancient marble bowl, tin tub, faint electric light, and a musty wooden panelling all around the plumbing fixtures. It being still daylight, I descended to the square and looked around for dinner of some sort, noticing as I did so to the strange glances I received from the unwholesome loafers. Since the grocery was closed, I was forced to patronize the restaurant I had shunned before. A stooped, narrow-headed man with his staring, unwinking eyes and a flat nose, wench with unbelievable thick and clumsy hands, being in attendance. The service was all of the counter type, and it relieved me to find that much was evidently served from cans and packages. A bowl of vegetables, soup with crackers was enough for me, and I soon headed back for my cheerless room at the Gilman. Getting an evening paper as I fly-specked a magazine from the evil-visaged clerk at the rickety stand behind his desk. As twilight deepened, I turned on the feeble electrical bulb over the cheap iron-framed bed. and I tried as I best I could continue reading I had begun. It felt advisable to keep my mind wholesomely occupied, for it would not do to brood over abnormalities of this ancient blight-shadowed town while I was still within its borders. The insane yarn I had heard from the aged drunkard did not promise very pleasant dreams, and I felt I must keep the image of his wild, watery eyes as far as possible from my imagination. Also, I must not dwell on what the factory inspector had told the Newburyport ticket agent about the Gilman house, and the voices of his nocturnal tenants. Not on that, nor on the face beneath the tiara in the black church doorway. The face for whose horror my consciousness could not account. It would perhaps have been easier to keep my thoughts from disturbing topics had the room not been so gruesomely musty. As it was, the lethal mustiness blended hideously with the town's general fishy odour, and persistently focused on one's fancy on a death and decay. Another thing that disturbed me was the absence of a bolt on the door and my room. One had been there, as marks clearly showed, but there were signs of a recent removal. No doubt it had become out of order like so many other things in this decrepit edifice. In my nervousness I looked around and discovered a bolt on the clothes press which I seemed to be in the same size, judging from the marks as one formerly on the door. To gain a partial relief from the general tension, I had busied myself by transferring this hardware to the vacant place with the aid of a handy 3-in-1 device, the screwdriver which I had kept in my keyring. The bolt fitted perfectly. I was somewhat relieved when I knew I could shoot it firmly upon retiring. Not that I had any real apprehension of its needs, but that any symbol of security was welcome in an environment of this kind. There were adequate bolts on the 2 lateral doors connecting rooms, and these I proceeded to fasten as well. I did not undress, but I decided to read until I was sleepy, then lie down with only my coat, collar, and shoes off. Taking a pocket flashlight from my valise, I placed it in my trousers, so that I could read my watch if I woke up later in the dark. Drowsiness, however, did not come, and when I stopped to analyse my thoughts, I found to my disquiet that I was really unconsciously listening for something which I dreaded but could not name. That inspector's story must have worked on my imagination more deeply than I had suspected. Again I tried to read, but found that I had made no progress. After a time I seemed to hear the stairs and corridors creak at intervals, as if with footsteps, and wonder if other rooms were beginning to fill up. There were no voices, however, and it struck me that there was something subtly furtive about the creaking. I did not like it, and debated whether I had better try to sleep at all. This town had some queer people, and there had undoubtedly been several disappearances. Was this one of those inns where travellers were slain for their money? Surely I had no look of excessive prosperity, or were the townsfolk really so resentful about curious visitors? Had my obvious sightseeing, with its frequent Mac consultations, aroused unfavourable notice? It occurred to me that I must be in a highly nervous state to let a few random creakings set me off speculating this fashion, but I regretted none the less that I was unarmed. At length, feeling a fatigue which had nothing of drowsiness in it, I bolted the newly outfitted hall door, turned off the light, and threw myself down on the hard, uneven bed, coat, collar, shoes, and all. In the darkness, even faint noise of the night seemed magnified, and a flood of doubtfully unpleasant thoughts swept over me. I was sorry I had put out the light, and was too tired to rise and turn it on again. Then, after a long, dreary interview, and prefaced by a fresh creaking of the stairs and corridor, there came that soft, damnable, unmistakable sound which seemed like a malign fulfilment of all my apprehensions. Without the least shadow of doubt, the lock on my hall door was becoming tired cautiously, furtively, tentatively with a key. My sensations upon recognising the sign of actual peril were perhaps less than rather than more tumultuous because of my previous vague fears. I had been, albeit without definite reason, instinctively on my guard, and that was on my advantage in the new and real crisis, whatever it might turn out to be. Nevertheless, the change in menace from vague premonition to immediate reality was a profound shock and fell upon me with the force of a genuine blow. It never once occurred to me that the fumbling might be a mistake. Malign purpose was all I could think of, and I kept deathly quiet and waiting for the would-be intruder's next move. After a time the cautious rattling ceased, and I heard the room to the north entered with a passkey. Then the lock of my connecting door to my room was softly tied, the bolt held, of course, and I heard the floor creak as a prowler left the room. After a moment there came another soft rattling, and I knew the room to the south was being entered, again furtively trying of a bolted connecting door, and again receding crackling. This time the creaking went along the hall and down the stairs, so I knew the prowler had realised the bolted conditions of my doors and was giving up his attempt for a greater or lesser time, as the future would show. The readiness with which I fell into plan of action proves that I must have been subconsciously fearing some menace and considering the possible avenues of escape. From this I felt the unseen fumbler meant a danger not to be met or dealt with, but only to be fled from precipitately as possible. The only thing to do now was to get out of the hotel alive as quickly as I could, and through some channel or other than the front stairs or lobby. Rising softly and throwing my flashlight on with the switch, I sought to the light of the bulb over my bed, and chose to pocket some of my belongings with a swiftness and flight. Nothing, however, happened, and I saw that the power had been cut off. Clearly, some cryptic evil movement was afoot on a large scale. Just what? I could not say. As I stood pondering with my hand on my now useless switch, I heard a muffled creaking on the floor below, and thought I could be barely distinguished voices in conversation. And a moment later I felt less sure about the deepening sounds were voices, since the apparent hoarse barkings and loose syllable croakings bore so little resemblance to recognised human speech. Then I thought with the renewed force of what the factory inspector had heard in the night with his mouldering and pestilential building. Having filled my pockets with my flashlight's aid, I put on my hat and tiptoed towards the window and considered my chances of descent. Despite the state's safety regulations, there was no fire escape on this side of the hotel, and I saw that my windows, commanded only by a sheer 3-story drop onto the cobbled courtyard on the right and left, however, some ancient brick business blocks abutted on the hotel, their slant roofs coming up to reasonable jumping distance from my 4th-story level. To reach either of these landline buildings, I would have to be in a room with 2 doors from my own, in one case on the north and the other case on the south, and my mind instantly set to work, calculating what chance I had making the transfer. I could not, I decided, risk an emergence into the corridor, when my footsteps would surely be heard, and that where difficulties of entering a desired room would now be insuperable. My progress, if it was to be made at all, would have to be through the less solid but built connecting doors of my rooms, the locks and bolts which I could never force violently, using my shoulders as a battering ram whenever they were against me. This, I thought, would be possible, owing to the rickety nature of the house and its fixtures, but then I realised I could not do it noiselessly. I would have to count on sheer speed and the chance of getting out the window before hostile forces became coordinated enough to open the right door towards me with a passkey. My own outer door I reinforced by pushing the bureau against it little by little in order to make a minimum of sound. I perceived my chances were very, very slender. I was fully prepared at any calamity, and even getting another roof would not solve the problem. For there would be the remain of the task of reaching ground and escaping from the town. One thing in my favour was the deserted and ruinous state of the abutting buildings, and the number of skylights gaping blackly open in each row. Gathering from the grocery boy's map the best route of the town was southward, I glanced first at the connecting door on the south side of my room. It was designed to open in my direction, hence I saw, after drawing the bolt and finding the other fastenings in place, it was not favourable one for forcing. Accordingly, abandoning it as a route, I cautiously moved the bedstead against it to hamper any attack which might be made on it later in the next room. The door on the north was hung to open away from me, and this, though a test provided it to be locked or bolted from the other side, I knew must be my route. If I could gain the roofs of the building in the Payne Street and descended successfully onto the ground level, I might perhaps dart through the courtyard and the adjacent and opposite buildings, to Washington or Bates, or else emerge in Payne and edge around the southward into Washington. In any case, I would aim to strike Washington somehow and get quickly out of the town square region. My preference would be to avoid Payne, since the fire station there might be open all night. As I thought of these things, I looked over the squalid sea of decaying roofs below me, now brightened by the beams of the moon, not much past full. On the right, the black gash of the river gorge clove the panorama, abandoned factories and railroad stations clinging to barnacle-like to its strides. The abandoned factories and railway stations clinging to barnacle-like. Abandoned factories and railroad stations clinging barnacle-like to its sides. Beyond it was a rusted railway, and the Rowley Road led off. Beyond it, the rusted railway and the Rowley Road led off on a flat, marshy terrain dotted with islets of higher and drier scrub ground land. On the left, creek-threaded countryside was nearer, the narrow road to Ipswich gleaming white in moonlight. I could not see from my side of the Hotel Southwood route to Arkham, which I had determined to take. I was irresolutely speculating on when I had a better attack. I was irresolutely speculating on when I had a better attack the northward door, and how I could at least audibly manage it, when I noticed that vague noises underfoot had given place to a fresh and heavier creaking of stairs. I had noticed the vague noises underfoot had given place to a fresh and heavier creaking of the stairs. A wavering flickering of the light showed through my transom that the boards of corridor began to groan with ponderous, loud, muffled sounds of all possible vocal origin, and a firm knock at the door. And at length, a firm knock came at my outer door. For a moment I simply held my breath and waited. Eternity seemed to elapse, and the nauseous, fishy odour of my environment seemed to mount suddenly and spectacularly. The knocking was repeated, continuously, and with growing insistence. I knew that I had time for my action to come, and forthwith drew the bolt of my northward door connecting, bracing myself for the task of battering it open. The knocking waxed louder, and I hoped that its volume would covering the sound of my efforts at the beginning of my attempt. I lunged again and again at the thin panelling with my left shoulder. Heedless of shock or pain, the door resisted, even more than I expected, but I did not give in. All the while the clamour at the outer door increased. Finally the connecting door gave, but with such a crash I knew outside must have heard it. Finally the connecting door gave, but with such a crash I know those outside must have heard it. Instantly the outside knocking became a violent battering, with keys sounding ominously in the hall doors of the rooms on both sides of me. Rushing through the newly opened connection, I succeeded in bolting the northerly hall door before I could lock it, and turned. But even as I did so, I heard the hall door of the third room, the one from whose window I had hoped to reach off the roof below, being tried with a pass key. For an instant I felt absolute despair, since my trapping in a chamber with no window ingress seemed complete. A wave of almost abnormal horror swept over me, and invested with a terrible but unexplainable singularity. The flashlight glimpsed into dust prints made by the intruder who had lately tried my door from this then. The flashlight glimpsed dust prints made by the intruder who had lately tried my door from this room. Then, with a dazed automatism which persisted despite the hopelessness, I made an effort to get through, and granting the fastenings might be providentially intact as the second room, bolt the hall door beyond before the lock could be turned from the outside. Sheer fortunate chance gave me my reprieve, for the connecting door before me was not only unlocked, but actually ajar. In a second I was through, and had my right knee and shoulder against the hall door, which was visible opening inward. My pressure took the opener off guard, for the thing shut as I pushed, so that I could slip the well-conditioned bolt, and I had done with the other room. As I gained this respite, I heard the battering of the other two doors above. I heard the battering at the other two doors abate, while a confused clatter came from the connecting door. I had shielded with the bedstead, evidently. Came from the connecting door. As I gained this respite, I heard the battering at the two other doors abate, while a confused clattering came from the connecting door I had shielded with the bedstead. Evidently, the bulk of my assailants had entered the southerly room and were massing in a lateral attack. But at the same moment, a passkey sounded in the next door to the north, and I knew that the nearer peril was at hand. The northward connecting door was wide, but there was no time to think about checking the already turning lock in the hall. All I could do was to shut and bolt against the connecting door, as well as its mate on the opposite side, pushing a bedstead against the one and the bureau against the other, and moving a washstand in front of the hall door. I saw, trust to such make such makeshift barriers to shield me till I could get out of the window on the roof on the Payne Street block. But even in this acute moment, my chief horror was something apart from the Even in this acute moment of chief horror was something apart from intermediate weakness of my defences. I was shuddering because I had not one of my pursuers, despite hideous paintings, gruntings and subdued barkings at odd intervals, was uttering an unmuffled or intelligible vocal sound. As I moved the furniture toward the windows, I heard a frightful scurrying along the corridor toward the room north of me, and perceived that the southward battering had ceased. Plainly, most of the occupants were now. Plainly, most of my opponents were about to concentrate against the feeble connecting door which they knew must open directly on me. Outside, the moon played on the ridge pool of the block below, and I saw that the jump would be desperately hazardous because of the steep surface on which I must land. Surveying the conditions, I chose the more southerly of the two windows as my avenue of escape, planning to land on the inner slope of the roof and make for the nearest skylight. Once inside of the decrepit brick structures, I would have to reckon with my pursuit, but I hoped to descend and dodge it in and out of the yawning doorways along the shadowed courtyard, eventually getting to Washington Street and slipping out of town towards the south. The clatter of the northerly connecting door was now terrific, and I saw that the weak panelling was beginning to splinter. Obviously, the besiegers had brought some ponderous object into play as a battering ram. The bedstead, however, still held firm, so that I had at least a faint chance of making a good escape. As I opened the window, I noticed that it was flanked by heavy velour draperies suspended by a pole brass rings. And also, there was a large projecting catch from the shutters on the exterior. Seeing as a possible means of avoiding the dangerous jump, I yanked at the hangings, bringing them down, pole and all, then quickly hooking on two of the rings in the shutter catch and flinging the drapery outside. The heavy folds reached fully to the abutting roof, and I saw the rings and the catch would likely bear my weight. So climbing out of the window and down the improvised rope ladder, I left behind me forever the morbid and horror-infested fabric of the Gilman house. I landed safely on the loose slates of the steep roof and succeeded in gaining the gaping black skylight without a slip. Glancing up at the window I had left, I observed it was still dark, though far across the crumbling chimneys to the north I could see lights ominously blazing in the Order of Dagon Hall, the Baptist Church, and the Congregational Church, which I realized I was shivering. There had seemed to be no one in the courtyard below. I had hoped there would be a chance to get away before spreading of the general alarm, Flashing my pocket lamp into the skylight, I saw there was no steps down. The distance was slight, however, so I clambered over the brink and dropped, striking a dusty floor littered with crumbling boxes and barrels. The place was ghoulish looking, but I was past minding such impressions and made out. The place was ghoulish looking, but I was past minding such impressions, and made at once for the staircase revealed by my flashlight. After a hasty glance at my watch, which still showed the hour to be 2 a.m., the steps creaked, but seemed tolerably sound. I raced down past a barn-like secondary store to the... I raced down past a barn-like secondary story. I raced down past a barn-like second story to the ground floor. The desolation was complete, and only echoes answered my footfalls. At length I reached the lower hall. At one end of which I saw a faint luminous rectangle marking the ruined street. I saw a faint luminous rectangle marking the ruined-paned street doorway. Heading the other way, I found the back door also open and darted out 5 stone steps up the grass-grown cobblestones of the courtyard. The moonbeams did not reach down here, but I could just see my way about without using the flashlight. Some of the windows of the Gilman house side were faintly glowing, and I thought I heard confused sounds within. Walking softly over to Washington Street, I perceived several open doorways and chose the nearest as my route out. The hallway inside was black, and when I reached the opposite end, I saw the street door was wedged immovably shut. Resolved to try another building, I groped my way back towards the courtyard, but stopped short when close to the doorway. For out of the open door in the Gilman house, a large crowd of doubtful shapers were pouring, lanterns bobbing in the darkness, and horrible croaking voices exchanged low cries in what was certainly not English. The figures moved uncertainly, and I realized to my relief that they did not know where I had gone. But for all that, there sent a shiver of horror through my frame. Their features were indistinguishable, but their crouching and shambling gait was abnormally repellent. And worst of all, I perceived that one of the figures was strangely robed and unmistakable, and surmounted by a tall tiara of a design altogether too familiar. As the figures spread throughout the courtyard, I felt my fears increase. Suppose I could find no egress from this building on the other side? The fishy odour was detestable, and I wondered I could stand it without fainting. Again, groping toward the street, I opened the door of the hall and came up the empty room. With a closely shuttered but sashless window, thumping in the rays of my flashlight, I found I could open the shutters, and in another moment I had climbed outside and was carefully closing the aperture in the window. I was now in Washington Street, and for the moment saw no living thing nor any light save that from the moon. From several directions in the distance, however, I could hear the sound of hoarse voices and footsteps of a curious kind and pattering which did not sound quite like footsteps. Plainly, I had no time to lose. The points of the compass were clear to me, and I was glad to be out of the street lights that all the street lights were turned off, as often is common. I was glad that all the street lights were turned off, as is custom on the strongly moonlight nights in preposterous rural regions. Some of the sounds came from the south, yet I retained my design of escaping in that direction. There would, I know, be plenty of destroyed doorways to shelter me in case if any... There would, I know, be plenty of deserted doorways to shelter me in case any person or group who looked like pursuers. I walked rapidly, softly and close to the ruined house. Wild hatless and dishevelled from my arduous climb, I did not look especially noticeable, and stood a good chance of passing unheeded if forced to enter any casual wayfarer. At Bates Street, I drew a yawning vegetable. At Bates Street, I drew a yawning vestibule. At Bates Street, I drew into a yawning vestibule while two shambling figures crossed in front of me, but soon on my way again, approaching the open space where Elliott Street obliquely crosses Washington in the intersection of the South. Though I had never seen this space, it had looked dangerous to me on the grocery youth's map. Since the moonlight would have free play there was no use trying to evade it, for any alternative course would involve detours and possibly disastrous visibility and delaying effect. The only thing to do was to cross it boldly and openly, imitating the typical shamble of the Innsmouth folk as best as I could, and trusting that no one, or at least no pursuer of mine, would be there. Just how fully the pursuit was organised, and indeed just the purpose might be, I could form no idea. There seemed to be an unusual activity in the town, but I judged that news of my escape of the Gilman had not yet spread. I would, of course, soon have to shift from Washington to some other southward street, for that party from the hoedown would be doubtless after me. I must have dust prints in that old last building, revealing how I gained the street. The open space was, as I expected, strongly moonlit, and I saw the remains of park life iron-railed green in its centre. Fortunately, no one was about, though a curious sort of buzz or roar seemed to be increasing in my direction of Town Square. South Street was very wide, leading directly down a slightly declivity toward the waterfront, and commanding a long view out to sea. I had hoped that no one would be glancing up it from afar as I crossed the bridge moonlight. My progress was unimpeded, and no fresh sound arose to hint that I had been spied. Glancing about me, I involuntarily let my pace slacken for a second to take in the sight of the sea, gorgeous in its burning moonlight at the street's end. Far up beyond the breakwater was the dim, dark line of Devil's Reef, and as I glimpsed at it, I could not help but thinking of the hideous legends I had heard in the last 34 hours. Legends which portrayed the Ragged Rock as a veritable gateway to the realms of unfathomed horror and inconceivable abnormality. An inconceivable gateway to the realms of unfathomable horror and inconceivable abnormality. Then, without warning, I saw the intermittent flashes of light in distant wreath. They were definite and unmistakable, and awakened in my mind a blind horror beyond all rational proportions. My muscles tightened for a panic flight and held in by the certain unconsciousness, caution and half-hypnotic fashion. And to make matters worse, there now flashed forth from the lofty cupola of the Gilman house, which loomed up towards the northwest behind me, a series of analogous, though differently, spaced gleams which could be nothing less than an answering signal. Controlling my muscles and realizing afresh how plainly visible I was, I resummed my brisker and faintly shambled pace, though keeping my eyes on that hellish, ominous reef. As long as the opening of South Street gave me a seaward view, what the whole proceeding meant I could not imagine, unless it involved some strange rite connecting with Devil's Reef, or unless some party had landed on the ship on the sinister rock. I now bent to the left and round the ruinous green, still gazing towards the ocean as it blazed in the spectral summer moonlight, one watching the cryptical flashing of the nameless, unexplainable beacons. It was then that the most horrible impression of all was borne in upon me. It destroyed my last vestige of self-control and set me running frantically southward past the yawning black doorways and fishly staring windows that deserted Nightmare Street. For at a closer glance I saw the moonlight waters between the reef and the shore were far from empty. They were alive with teeming horde of shapes, swimming inward and toward the town. and even at my vast distance and my single moment of perception, I could tell that the bobbing heads and flailing arms were alien in an aberrant way, scarcely to be expressed and consciously formulated. My frantic running ceased before I had covered a block far from my left. I began to hear something like a hue or a cry over an organised pursuit. There were footsteps and guttural sounds and rattling motor wheeze south along Federal Street. In a second, all my plans were utterly changed, for if the southward highway were blocked ahead of me, I must clearly find another egress from Innsmouth. I found and drew him into a gaping doorway, reflecting how lucky I was to have left the moonlight open space before these pursuers came down the parallel street. A second reflection was less comforting. Since the pursuit was down another street, it was plain that the party was not following me directly. It had not seen me, but was simply obeying a general plan for cutting off my escape. This, however, implied that all roads leading out of Innsmouth were similarly patrolled, for the Desertons could not have known what route I intended to make. If this were so, I would not have to make any retreat across the country, away from any road. But how could I do that in view of the marshy and creek-riddled nature of the surrounding region? For a moment my brain reeled, both from sheer helplessness and from a rapid increase of the omnipresent fishy odour. Then I thought of the abandoned railway to Rowley, whose solid line of blasted weed-grown earth still stretched off the northwest from the crumbling station on the edge of the river gorge. There was just a chance that the townsfolk would not think of that, since its bread choked desertion made itself half impassable, and would be the unlikeliest of all avenues for a fugitive to choose. I had seen it clearly from my hotel window, and knew about how it lay. Most of its earlier length was uncomfortably visible from Rowley and the high places in the town itself, but one could perhaps crawl inconspicuously through the undergrowth. At any rate, it would form the only chance of deliverance. There's nothing to do but try it. Drawing the inside of my deserted shelter, I once consulted the grocery boy's map with the aid of my flashlight. The immediate problem was how to reach the ancient railway. I now saw that the safest course was ahead to Babson Street, then west to Lafayette. There, edging around but not crossing an open space homologous to the one I had traversed, and subsequently banked northward and westward in a zigzagging line through Lafayette, Bates, Adams and Bank Streets, the latter skirting the river gorge to the abandoned and dilapidated station I had seen from my window. My reason for going ahead to Babson was that I wished neither to recross the earlier space nor begin from my westward course along this course. My reason for going ahead to Babson was that I wished neither to recross the earlier open space, nor to begin with my westward course along the cross street as my broader south. Starting once more, I crossed the street into the right-hand side in order to edge around into Babson as inconspicuously as possible. Noises still contained in Federal Street. As I glanced behind me, I thought I saw a gleam of light near the building through which I had escaped. Anxious to leave Washington Street, I broke into a quiet dog trot, trusting to luck into. Next, the corner of Babson Street, I saw to my alarm that one of the houses was still inhabited, as attested by curtains at the window, but there was no lights within as I passed it without disaster. In Babson Street, which crossed Federal, and might thus reveal me to the searchers, I clung as closely as possible to the sagging, uneven buildings, twice pausing in a doorway with the noises behind me momentarily increased. The open space ahead shone wide and desolate under the moon, but my route would not force me to cross it. During my second pause, I began to detect a fresh distribution of vague sounds, and upon looking cautiously out from the cover behind the motor car, darting across the open space, bound outward along Elliott Street, which there were intersects of both Babson and Lafayette. As I watched, choked by a sudden rise in the fishy odour, and after a short abatement, I saw a band of uncouth, crouching shapes loping and shambling in the same direction, and knew that this must be the party of guarding Ipswich Road, since the highway forms an extension of Elliot Street. Two of the figures I glimpsed were in voluminous robes, and one wore a peaked diadem which glistened whitely within the moonlight. The gait of this figure was so odd that it sent a chill through me, for it seemed that this creature was almost hopping. When the last of the band was out of sight, I resumed my progress, darting around the corner into Lafayette Street and crossing Elliot very hurriedly, lest the stragglers of the party be still advancing through there. I did hear some croaking and clattering sounds far off towards Town Square, but accomplished passage without any disaster. My greatest dread was recrossing the broad and moonlight. My greatest dread was in recrossing the broad and moonlight South Street, with its seaward view, and I had the nerve to force myself in the ordeal. Someone might easily be looking, and possible Elliot Street stragglers could not fair to glimpse me from the other 2 points. At the last moment I decided I had better slacken my trot and make a crossing as I before the shambling gait of an average Innsmouth native. With the view of the water again opened out, this time on my right, I was half determined not to look at it at all. I could not, however, resist, but as I cast sidelong glance as I carefully, imitatively shambled toward the protecting shadows ahead. There was no ship visible, as I had half expected there would be. Instead, the first thing which caught my eye was a small rowboat pulling in toward the abandoned wharves and laden with some bulky tarpaulin-covered object. Its rowers, though distinctively and indistinctively seen, were a especially repellent aspect. Several swimmers were still discernible, while on the far back reef I could not see a faint but steady glow unlike the winking beacon visible from before, and of curious colour which I could not precisely identify. Above the slant roofs and ahead to the right there loomed a tall cupola of the Gulliman's house, but it was completely dark. The fishy odour dispelled for a moment by some merciful breeze now closed in again with a maddening intensity. I had not quite crossed the street when I heard the muttering band of it advancing along Washington from the north, as they had reached the broad open space which I had first acquired in glimpse of the moonlight water. I could see them plainly, only a block away, and was horrified by the bestial abnormality of their faces, the dog-like subhumanness of their crouching gait. One man moved in the positively simian way, with long arms frequently touching the ground, while another figure, robed and tiaraed, seemed to progress in almost in hopping fashion. I judged this party to be one I had seen in the Gilmans, the one therefore most closely on my tail. As some of the figures turned to look in my direction, I was transfixed with fright, yet managed to preserve the casual shambling gait I had assumed. To this day, I do not know whether they saw me or not. If they did, my stratagem must have deceived them, for they passed on across with the moonlight space without varying their course. Meanwhile, the croaking and jabbering of some hateful, guttering patriots I could not divine. Once more in the shadow, I resumed my former dog trot past the leaning and decrepit houses that stared blankly into the night. Having crossed the western sidewalk, I rounded the nearest corner into Bates Street, where I kept close to the buildings on the southern side. I passed 2 houses showing signs of habitation, one of which had faint lights on the upper rooms, yet met with no obstacle. As I turned into Adam Street, I felt immeasurably safer, perceived a shock when a man reeled out of the black doorway directly in front of me. He proved, however, too hopelessly drunk to be a menace, so that I reached the dismal ruins of Bank Street warehouses in safety. No one was staring the dead street. No one was staring in that dead street beside the river gorge, and the roar of the waterfalls quieted quite drowned my footsteps. It was a long dog trot to the ruined station, and the great brick warehouse walls that around me seemed more and more terrifying than the fronts of those private houses. At last I saw the ancient arcaded station, or what was left of it, and made directly for the tracks started from there in Father's End. I made directly for the tracks that started from its further end. The rails were rusty but mainly intact, and not more than half the tyres had rotted away. Walking or running on the surface would be very, very difficult, but I did my best, and the whole made the very fair time. For some distance, the line kept on along the gorge's brink, but at length I reached the long covered bridge, where it crossed the chasm at dizzy height. The condition of this bridge would determine my next step. If humanly possible, I would use it. If not, I would have to. If humanly possible, I would use it. If not, I'd have to risk more street wandering and take the nearest intact highway bridge. The vast barn-like of the old bridge gleamed spectrally in the moonlight, and I saw that ties were safe for now, for at least within a few feet. What the fuck? The vast barn-like length of the old bridge gleamed spectrally in the moonlight, and I saw that ties were safe for at least a few feet within. Entering, I began to use my flashlight, and was almost knocked down by the cloud of bats that flapped past me, but halfway across the perilous gap, and the ties which I had feared for a moment would halt me, but in the end I risked a desperate jump, which I fortunately succeeded. I was glad to see the moonlight again when I emerged from that macabre tunnel. The old tracks crossed the river at guard, and at once veered off into a region increasingly rural and less of Innsmouth's abhorrent fishy odour. Here the dense growths of weeds and briars hindered me and cruelly tore my clothes, but I was none the less glad that they were there to give me concealment in case of peril. I knew that much of a route must be visible from the Rowley Road. The marshy region began very shortly, with a single track of lowly grass embankment where the weedy growth was somewhat thinner. Then came a sort of island of higher ground, where the line passed through a shallow open cut choked with bushes and bramble. I was very glad of the partial shelter, since at this point the Rowley Road was uncomfortably near according to my window view. At the end of the cut he would cross the track and swerve off to a safety distance, but meanwhile I must exceedingly be careful. I was by this time thankfully certain that the railway itself was not patrolled. Just before entering the cut I glanced behind me, but there was no pursuer. The ancient spires and roof decaying Innsmouth gleamed lovely in the ethereal and magical yellow moonlight. I thought of how they must have looked in the old days, before the shadow fell. Then, as my gaze circled inland toward town, something less tranquil arrested my notice and held me immobile for a second. What I saw, or fancied I saw, was a disturbing suggestion of an undulant motion from the south, a suggestion which made me conclude that a very large horde must be pouring out of the city along the level Ipswich Road. The distance was great, and I could not distinguish nothing in detail, but I did not at all like the look of that moving column. It undulated too much, and glistened too brightly in the rays of the now westering moon. There was a suggestion of sound too, though the wind was blowing in the other way, a suggestion of bestial scraping and bellowing, even worse than the muttering of the parties I had lately overheard. All sorts of unpleasant conjectures crossed my mind, and I thought those very extreme Innsmouth types to be hidden in crumbling centuried warrens near the waterfront. I thought, too, of the nameless swimmers I had seen Counting the parties so far glimpsed, as well as the presumably covering of the other robes, the numbers of my pursuers must be strangely large for a town depopulated as Innsmouth. Whence could come the dense personnel of such column as I now beheld? Did those ancient unplumbed warrens teem with a twisted, uncatalogued, and unsuspected life? Or had some unseen ship indeed landed on the region unknown to the outsiders of the hellish reef? Who were they? What? Why were they? And if such a column of them was scouring the Ipswich road, would the patrols of the other roads be likely augmented? And if such a column of them was scouting the Ipswich road, would the patrols of the other roads likely be augmented? I had entered the bush-grown cut and was struggling along at a very slow pace, when a damnable fishy odour again waxed dominant. Had the wind suddenly changed eastward, so that it would blow from the sea over the town? It must have, I concluded, since I now began to hear the shocking guttural murmurs from the Heathrow from silent direction. There was another sound too, a kind of a wholesale colossal flopping or pattering, which somehow called up images of the most detestable of sort. It made me think illogically of that unpleasant, undulating column of the far-off Ipswich road. And then, both stench and sounds grew stronger, so that I paused shivering, grateful for the cut's protection. It was here. I recalled the Rowley Road drew so close to the old railway because... It was here, I recalled, that the Rowley Road drew so close to the old railway before crossing westward and diverging. Something was coming along that road, and I must lie low till its passage and vanishment in the distance. Thank heaven these creatures employed no dogs for tracking, though perhaps that would be impossible amidst the omnipresent regional odour. Crouched in the bushes of the sandy cleft, I recently felt safe, even though I knew the searchers would have to cross me in track of some... Ugh. Even though I crouched in the bushes of that sandy cleft, I felt reasonably safe. Crouched in the bushes of the sandy cleft, I felt raspberry? Crouched in the bushes of that sandy cleft, I felt reasonably safe, even though I knew the searchers would have to cross the track in front of me, not much more than 100 yards away. I would be able to see them, but they could not accept be a Magdalene miracle. Seeing me. All at once, I began dreading to look at them as they passed. I saw the close moonlit space where they would surge by, and had curious thoughts about the irredeemable pollution of that space. They would perhaps be the worst of all Innsmouth types. Something one would not care to remember. The stench waxed overpowering, and the noises swelled to a bestial babble of croaking and baying and barking, without the least suggestion of human speech. Were these indeed the voices of my pursuers? Did they have dogs after all? So I had not seen the lower animals in Innsmouth. That flopping or pattering was the most monstrous. I could not look up at the degenerate creatures responsible for it. I would keep my eyes shut till the sounds receded to the west. The horde was very close now. The foul air filled with their hoarse snarlings and growl. The air foul with their hoarse snarlings and the ground almost shaking with their alien rhythm footfalls. My breath nearly ceased to come, and I put every ounce of my willpower into the task of holding my eyelids down. I am not even yet willing to say whether what followed in hideous activity. I am not even yet willing to say whether what followed was a hideous actuality of a nightmare or a hallucination. The later action of the government after my frantic appeals would tend to confirm that it is a monstrous truth, but could not. The later action of the government after my frantic appeals would tend to confirm it was a monstrous truth, but could not, at a hallucination, have been I don't even know what I'm saying. The later action of the government, after my frantic appeals, would tend to confirm it was a monstrous truth, but could not, at a hallucination, have been repeated under the quasi-hypnotic spell of that ancient haunted and shadowed town. Such places have strange properties, and the legacy of the insane legend might as well have been acted on. Such places have strange properties, and the legacy of the insane legend might have well acted on those more than human imagination. Amidst those dead, stench-cursed streets and huddled, rotted roofs of crumbling steeples, it is not impossible to the germ of the actual contagious madness lurks in the depths of the shadows over Innsmouth. Who can be sure of the reality after the hearing of the things of the old tales like Zadok Island? The government men never found poor Zadok, and have no conjectures to make what became of him. Where does the madness leave off, and the reality begin? Is it possible that even my latest fear is sheer delusion? But I must try to tell what I thought when I saw on that moonlight mocking yellow moon. Saw surging and hopping down the Rowley Road in plain sight of me, as I crouched from the wild brambles in that desolate railway cut. Of course my resolution to keep my eyes shut had failed. It was foredoomed to failure. For who could crouch blindly while a legion of croaking, baying entities of unknown source flut noisomely past scarcely more than 100 metres away? I thought I was prepared for the worst, and I really ought to have been prepared for considering what I had seen before. My other pursuers had been accursedly abnormal, so should I have not been ready for a strengthening of those abnormal elements? To look up forms in which there were no mixture of the normal at all? I did not open my eyes until the rancid clamour came loudly from a point obviously straight ahead. Then I knew a long section of them must be plainly in sight, where the sides of the cut flattened out and the road crossed the track. I could no longer keep myself from sampling whatever horror that leering yellow moonlight had to show. It was the end, for whatever remains to me of life on the surface of this earth, of every vestige of mental peace and confidence in the integrity of nature and of human mind. Nothing that I could have imagined, nothing even I could even gathered had I credited old Zadok's crazy tale in the most literal way, would be any way comparable to those demonic, blasphemous reality that I saw, or I believe that I saw. I have tried to hint what it was in order to postpone the horror of writing it down so badly. Can it be possible that this planet actually spawns such things that human eyes have truly seen, as objective flesh, what man has hitherto known only in verbal fantasy and tenuous legend? And yet I saw them in a limitless stream, flopping, hopping, croaking and bleating, surging inhumanly through the spectral moonlight in a grotesque, malignant saraband of fantastic nightmare. And some of them had old, tall tiaras of that nameless whitish gold metal, and some were strangely robed, and one who led the way was clad in ghoulishly humped back black coat and striped trousers, and had a man's felt hat perched on the shapeless stain that answered for a head. I think their predominant colour was a greyish green, though they had white bellies. They were mostly shiny and slippery, but the ridges of their backs were scaly. Their forms vaguely suggested anthropoid, while their heads were heads of fish, with bulging eyes that never closed. At the sides of their necks were palpitating gills, their long paws were webbed. They hopped irregularly, sometimes on 2 legs and sometimes on 4. I was somehow glad that they had no more than 4 limbs. Their croaking, baying voices, clearly used for articulate speech, had all dark shades of expression which their staring faces lacked. But for all their monstrousness, they were not unfamiliar to me. I knew too well what they must be, for was not the memory of that evil tiara at Newburyport still fresh? They were the blasphemous fish frogs of the nameless design, living and horrible, and as I saw them I knew also what a humped tiared priest in the black church basement had so fearsomely reminded me of. Their number was past guessing. It seemed to me that there were limitless swarms of them, and certainly My momentary glimpse could have only shown at least a fraction. In another instant, everything was blotted out by a merciful fit of fainting, the first I ever had. Chapter 5. It was a gentle daylight rain that waked me from my stupor in the brush-grown railway cut, and when I staggered out of the roadway ahead I saw no trace of any prints in the fresh mud. The fishy odour, too, was gone. Innsmouth's ruined roofs and toppling steeples loomed greyly towards the southeast, but not a living creature did I spy in the desolate salt marshes around. My watch was still going, and told me the hour was past noon. The reality of what I had been through was highly uncertain in my mind, but I felt something hideous lay in the background. I must get away from this evil, shadowed Innsmouth, and accordingly I began to rest my cramped, wearied powers of locomotion. Despite weakness, hunger, and horror, and bewilderment, I found myself after a time able to walk, so started slowly along the muddy road to Rowley. Before evening I was in the village, getting a meal and providing myself with the presentable clothes. I caught the night train to Arkham and the next day talked long and earnestly with the government officials there, a process I later repeat in Boston. With the main result of these colloquies, the public is now familiar, and I wish for normality's sake there was nothing more to tell. Perhaps it is madness that is overtaking me yet. Perhaps a greater horror, or a greater marvel, is reaching out. As may well be imagined, I gave up most of my foreplanned features on the rest of my tour, the scenic, architectural, antiquarian diversions of which I accounted so heavily. Nor did I dare look for that piece of strange jewellery said to be back in the Miskatonic University Museum. I did, however, improve my stay in Arkham by collecting some genealogical notes I had long wished to possess. Very rough and hasty data, it is true, but capable of good use later on when I might have time to collate and codify them. The curator of the Historical Society there, Mr. E. Lapham Peabody, was very courteous about assisting me, and expressed unusual interest when I told him I was the grandson of one Eliza Orne of Arkham, who was born in 1867, and had married James Williamson of Ohio at the age of 17. It seemed that a maternal uncle of mine had been there many years before on a quest like my own, and my grandmother's family was the topic of some local curiosity. There had, Mr. Peabody said, been some considerable discussion about the marriage of her father, Benjamin Orne, just after the Civil War, since the ancestry of the bride was peculiarly puzzling. That bride was understood to have been an orphaned Marsh of the New Hampshire, a cousin of the Essex county. But her education had been in France, and she knew very little of her family. A guardian deposited funds in the Boston Bank to maintain her and her French governess. But that guardian's name was unfamiliar to the Arkham people, and in time he dropped out of sight, so that the governess assumed his role by court appointment. The French woman, now long dead, was very taciturn, and there were those who said she could have been more than she did. But the most baffling thing was the inability of anyone to place the recorded parents of a young woman, Enoch and Lydia Meserve Marsh, among the known families of New Hampshire. Possibly, many suggested, she was the natural daughter of some Marsh of prominence. She had certainly the true Marsh eyes. Most of the puzzling was done after her early death, which took place at her birth of my grandmother, her only child. Having formed some disagreeable impressions connected with the name of Marsh, I did not welcome the news that it belonged in my own astral tree. Nor was I pleased that Mr. Peabody suggested that I had the true Marsh eyes myself. However, I was grateful for the data, which I knew would prove valuable, and took copious notes and lists of book references regarding the well-documented Orne family. I went directly home to Toledo from Boston and later spent a month at Malmi, recuperating from my ordeal. In September, I entered Oberlin for my final year, and from then till my next June was busy with studies and other wholesome activities, reminding of the bygone terror of occasional official visits from the government men in connection with the campaign with my pleas and evidence I had started. Around the middle of July, just a year after the Innsmouth experience, I spent a week with my late mother's family in Cleveland, checking some of my new genealogical data with various notes, traditions, and bits of heirloom material in existence there, and seeing what kind of connected chart I could construct. I did not exactly relish in this task, for the atmosphere of the William House home had always depressed me. There was a stain of morbidity there. My mother had never encouraged my visiting her parents as a child, although she always welcomed her father when he came to Toledo. My Arkham-born grandmother had seemed strange and almost terrifying to me. I do not think I grieved when she disappeared. I was 8 years old then, and it was said that she wandered off in grief after the suicide of my Uncle Douglas, her eldest son. He had shot himself after a trip to New England. The same trip, no doubt, which had caused him to be recalled to the Arkham Historical Society. This uncle resembled her, and I had never liked him either. Something about the staring, unwinking expression of both of them had given me a vague, unaccountable uneasiness. My mother and Uncle Walter had not looked like that. They were like their father, though poor little cousin Lawrence, Walter's son, had been almost perfect duplicate of his grandmother before his condition took him to the permanent seclusion of the sanitarium at Canton. I had not seen him in 4 years, but my uncle once implied that his state, both mental and physical, was very bad. This worry probably had been a major cause of his mother's death 2 years before. My grandfather and his widowed son Walter now compromised the Cleveland household, but the memory of older times hung thickly over it. I still disliked the place, and tried to get my research done as quickly as possible. Williamson records and traditions were supplied in abundance by my grandfather, though for orn material I had to depend on my uncle Walter, who put up at disposal the contents of his files, including notes, letters, cuttings, heirlooms, photographs, and miniatures. It was going in over the letters and pictures on the orn side that I began to acquire a kind of terror of my own ancestry. As I have said, my grandmother and my Uncle Douglas had always disturbed me. Now, years after their passing, I gazed at their pictured faces with a measurable heightened feeling of repulsion and alienation. I could not understand at first the change, but gradually a horrible sort of comparison began to obtrude itself on my unconscious mind, despite the steady refusal of my consciousness to admit even the least suspicion of it. It was clear that my typical expression of those faces now suggested something it had not suggested before, something which would bring stark panic if too openly thought of. But the worst shock came when my uncle showed me the orn jewellery in the downtown safe deposit vault. Some of the items were delicate and inspiring enough, but there was one box of strange old pieces descended from my mysterious great-grandmother, which my uncle was almost reluctant to produce. They were, he said, of very grotesque and almost repulsive design, and had never, to his knowledge, ever been seen publicly worn, though my grandmother used to enjoy looking at them. Vague legends of bad luck clustered around them, and my great-grandmother's French governess had said they ought not to be worn in New England, though it would be quite safe to wear them in Europe. As my uncle began slowly and grudgingly to unwrap the things, he urged me not to be shocked by the strangeness and frequent hideousness of the designs. Artists and archaeologists who had seen them pronounced the workmanship superlatively and exotically exquisite, though no one seemed to be able to define their exact material or assign them to a specific art tradition. There were 2 armlets, a tiara, and a kind of pictorial, the latter having in high relief certain figures of almost unbearable extravagance. During this description I had kept a tight rein on my emotions, but my face must have betrayed my mounting fears. My uncle looked concerned and paused in his unwrapping to study my countenance. I motioned to him to continue, which he did, with renewed signs of reluctance. He seemed to expect some demonstration when at the first piece, the tiara, became visible, but I doubt if he expected quite what actually happened. I did not expect it either, for that I was so thoroughly warned regarding what the jewellery could turn out to be. What I did was to faint silently away, just as I had done on the bridge-choked railway cut a year before. From that day on, my life has been a nightmare of brooding apprehension, nor do I know how much hideous is the truth and how much is madness. My great-grandmother had been a marsh of the unknown source whose husband lived in Arkham. Did not old Zadok say that the daughter of Obadiah Marsh by a monstrous mother was married to an Arkham man through a trick? What was it that the ancient toper had muttered about the likeness of my eyes to Captain Obadiah's? In Arkham too, the curator had told me I had the Marsh eyes. Was Obadiah Marsh my own great-great-grandfather?
Who or what, then, was my great-grandmother? But perhaps this was all madness. Those whitish gold ornaments might as easily been brought from Innsmouth by a sailor of my father's great-grandmother, whoever he was. And that look in the staring-eyed faces of my grandmother and the self-slain uncle be sheer fancy on my part, sheer fancy, bolstered up by the Innsmouth shadow which had so darkly colored my imagination. But why had my uncle killed himself after an ancestral quest in New England? For more than 2 years I thought of these reflections with his partial success. My father secured me a place in an insurance office, and I buried myself in routine as deeply as possible. In the winter of 1930 to 1931, however, the dreams began. They were very sparse and assiduous at first, but increased in frequency and vividness as the weeks went by. Great watery spaces opened out before me, and I seemed to wander through the titanic, sunken porticos of the labyrinths and the weedy Cyclopean walls with grotesque fishes as my companions. Then the other shapes began to appear, filling me with a nameless horror the moment I awoke. But during the dreams they did not horrify me at all. I was one with them, wearing their unhuman trappings, treading their aqueous ways, and preying monstrously at their evil sea-bottom temples. There was much more than I can remember, but even what I did remember each morning would be enough to stamp me as a madman or a genius if I ever dared to write it down. Some frightful influence I felt was seeking gradually to drag me out of the sane world of the wholesome life into the unnameable abyssness of the blackness and alienage, and the process told heavily on me. My health and appearance grew steadily worse till I was finally forced to give up my position, adopt the static, secluded life of an invalid. Some odd nervous affliction had me on its grip, and I found myself at times almost unable to shut my eyes. It was then I began to study the mirror with a mounting alarm. The slow ravages of disease are not pleasant to watch, but in my case there was something subtle and more puzzling in the background. My father seemed to notice it too, for he began looking at me curiously and almost affrightedly. What was taking place in me? Could it be that I was coming to resemble my grandmother and Uncle Douglas? One night I had a frightful dream in which my grandmother under the sea. She lived in a phosphorescent palace of many terraces, with gardens of strange lustrous corals and grotesque brachyte of efflorescence, and welcomed me with a warmth that may have been sardonic. She had changed, as are those who take her to the water change, and told me she'd never died, and instead she had gone to spot her dead son had learned about, and leaped into a realm whose wonder is destined for him as well as burned into with a smoking pistol. This was to be my realm too. I could not escape it. I would never die, but would live with those who had lived since before man ever walked the earth. I met also which had been her grandmother. For 80,000 years, Fazatlawi had lived in Yaha Nathway, and thither she had gone back after Obeded Marsh was dead. Yaha Nathway was not destroyed. When the upper earthmen shot death into the sea, it was hurt but not destroyed. The deep ones could never be destroyed, even though the Pelagian magic of the forgotten old ones might sometimes check for them. For the present, they would rest, but someday, if remembered, they would rise again for the tribute great Cthulhu craved. It would have been a city greater than Innsmouth next time. They had planned to spread and brought up which would help them, but now they must wait once more. For bringing the upper earth's men's death, I must do a penance, but that would not be heavy. This was the dream which I saw a Shoggoth for the first time, and the sight set me awake in a frenzy of screaming. That morning, the mirror definitely told me I had acquired the Innsmouth look. So far, I have not shot myself as Uncle Douglas did. I bought an automatic and almost took the step, but certain dreams deterred me. The tense extremes of horror are lessening, and I feel clearly drawn to the unknown sea depths, and instead of fearing, I hear and do strange things in sleep. and awake with a kind of exultation instead of terror. I do not believe I need to wait for the full change, as most have waited. If I did, my father would probably shut me up in a sanitarium, as my poor little cousin is shut up. Stupendous and unheard of splendour await me below, and I shall seek them soon. Ya Rilia Cthulhu Fatagin Ya. No, I shall not shoot myself. I cannot be made to shoot myself. I shall plan my cousin's escape from the Canton madhouse, and together we shall go to the marvel's shadowed Innsmouth. We shall swim out to the brooding reef in the sea and dive down through the black abysses to the Cyclopean and many-columned Yahanathway. And in that lair of the deep ones, we shall dwell amidst the wonder and glory forever. The end.